The phone rang at 8:47 on a Tuesday night, and I picked it up still holding a wet dinner plate in my other hand, my fingers pruning from dishwater, because in 16 years of marriage I had never once thought to look at the screen before answering my husband's phone when it rang in our own kitchen. Why would I? It was sitting on the counter where he always left it while he showered, face up, buzzing against the granite the way it did most nights, and I assumed, the way you assume the sun will come up, that it was the school calling about something Owen had done at baseball practice, or a robocall about our car's extended warranty, or possibly my own mother forgetting, again, that Greg's number and mine looked nothing alike. I set the plate in the rack, dried my hand on the dish towel hanging from the oven door, and I answered it the way I always answered any phone that rang in this house, like it belonged to all of us, because for 16 years I had believed, without ever once examining the belief, that it did. I said hello, and there was a half-second of silence on the other end, the kind of silence that in hindsight I understand now was a woman drawing a breath to launch into something she had rehearsed, something she was excited about, something she believed she was about to say to a friend named Priya, who she'd been texting with all afternoon about a girl's trip to Nashville. And instead of Priya's voice greeting her back, there was mine, a stranger's voice in a kitchen this woman had never heard of, in a life she did not yet fully understand she had just detonated. She said, breathless and grinning, I could hear the grin in it even before I understood a single word of what it meant. She said, okay, so I already booked the flight, and Greg said he's telling Melissa it's a work thing in Chicago, which, obviously, but I need you to help me figure out what to pack because the room he got has this insane view of the lake, and I am not trying to look like a librarian next to that view. I want you to understand that I did not immediately understand what I was hearing. That is the truth, and I am not going to clean it up to make myself sound sharper than I was in that moment, because the honest answer is that for maybe 4 full seconds, 4 seconds I have replayed more times than I can count, my brain simply refused to assemble the sentence into something that made sense. Melissa is my name. I am Melissa. Greg is telling Melissa it's a work thing in Chicago. Greg is my husband. Greg was, at that exact moment, 30 feet away from me, upstairs running the shower, humming something tuneless the way he always did, completely unaware that his phone had just handed his wife a sentence with her own name inside it, spoken by someone who did not know she was speaking to the very woman she was describing. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when two people on a phone call both realize, at almost exactly the same moment, that something has gone catastrophically wrong and it is different from ordinary silence, heavier. It has a texture to it, and I stood in my kitchen with dishwater drying on my hands, and I felt that silence arrive in my ear like a held breath. I said very quietly, very evenly, in a voice that did not yet belong to the woman I was about to become over the following 6 weeks, I said, I'm sorry, who is this? And she said, oh my God, wrong number, so sorry, and hung up so fast that the click of it sounded almost violent, and I stood there in my kitchen, in my own home, on Maple Ridge Court, in Cedar Falls, Ohio, holding a phone that was not mine, staring at a screen that said, call ended, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. And upstairs my husband kept humming in the shower, like the entire architecture of our marriage had not just quietly, invisibly, collapsed 3 feet from where I was standing. My name is Melissa Corwin. I am 41 years old. I have taught 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary in Cedar Falls for the last 15 years. I have 2 children who I would set myself on fire for without a second of hesitation. A boy named Owen who is 14 and thinks about baseball with the kind of totalizing devotion most people reserve for religion, and a girl named Lily who is 10 and has been taking ballet since she was 4 and moves through our house like she is perpetually counting 8 counts under her breath. I have been married to my husband, Gregory Corwin, for 16 years, together for 18, since a backyard barbecue thrown by our mutual friend Todd Baxley the summer after I finished my teaching certification. And I want to tell you everything that happened after that phone call, from the very first second to the very last, because I think there is a version of this story that everyone tells in a hurry, the version where the wronged wife finds out and immediately screams and throws a suitcase out a window. And that is not what happened to me. And I don't think it's what happens to most women in my position. And I think the real story, the slow and quiet and almost unbearably patient 6 weeks that came after that phone call, is the part nobody tells you about. So I am going to tell you all of it. But first you need to understand who we were before that Tuesday night, because I have learned, in the years since, that you cannot understand how completely a marriage can be hollowed out from the inside without first understanding how solid it looked from the outside, to me most of all. I met Greg Corwin 18 years ago at a backyard barbecue that neither of us actually wanted to go to. I remember this because we compared notes on it years later, laughing back when comparing notes on the early days of our relationship was still a thing we did easily, without either of us flinching. I had gone because Todd Baxley, who I'd known since college, had promised there would be people my age, and there absolutely was not. And Greg had gone because his roommate at the time dragged him there under threat of eating cereal for dinner for a week if he didn't show his face. We ended up standing next to the same cooler for 45 minutes because neither of us knew enough people to justify moving, and he made a joke about the potato salad that was, on reflection, not even a particularly good joke. But I laughed so hard that Coke came out of my nose a little, and he looked so genuinely delighted by that, by the actual physical evidence that he'd made someone laugh past the point of dignity, that I decided on the spot I wanted to see him make that face again. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday of all days. No ring box, no restaurant, just down on one knee in the produce aisle of the Kroger on 5th Street because he said he'd been carrying the ring around in his coat pocket for a week, waiting for the right moment, and finally decided the right moment was simply the next moment he saw my face, wherever that happened to be. We got married 16 years ago at a small church outside of Cedar Falls. 40-some guests. My father walked me down the aisle in the only suit he owned, and Greg cried during his vows in a way that embarrassed him for years afterward, and that I never once let him live down. We built an ordinary, good life together, the kind of life I understood, even while I was living it, to be a genuine privilege, not a birthright. Greg went into sales for a company called Halden Equipment Group, which manufactures and distributes industrial equipment, conveyor systems, packaging machinery, the unglamorous mechanical backbone of 100 factories most people never think about. And he worked his way up over 14 years from an entry-level territory rep to regional sales manager, a job that came with a company car, a modest but real bump in salary, and crucially, though none of us understood this at the time, a great deal of travel to the regional office in Columbus, 90 minutes from our house, and to industry conventions 2 or 3 times a year. I kept teaching 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary, a job I loved with an intensity that surprised me every single September, and we had Owen 14 years ago, a baby who arrived 3 weeks early and screaming and has apparently not stopped needing an audience since, and Lily 10 years ago, calm where her brother was chaotic, watchful in a way that unsettled her preschool teachers a little, the kind of child who notices when a coaster has been moved 2 inches to the left. We bought our house on Maple Ridge Court 12 years ago, a modest 4-bedroom colonial with a crooked shutter on the garage that Greg promised for a decade to fix and never did. And it became the entire physical container of our life together. Birthday parties in the backyard, a tree that Owen fell out of and broke his wrist at age 8, a kitchen where I've made approximately 4,000 dinners over 12 years, give or take a few hundred. We had rhythms. We had rituals. The small invisible architecture that holds a marriage together on the ordinary Tuesdays that never make it into anyone's wedding vows. Ours was this. Every single Tuesday night, after dinner, after the kids' homework was checked and their lunches were packed for the next day, I would wash the dinner dishes by hand at our kitchen sink, an old habit from my mother's house that I never broke even after we got a dishwasher, because there was something about the warm water and the quiet that settled me after a day of 9-year-olds, and Greg would go upstairs and shower, and I would hear the pipes groan the way they always did in our old house, and I would hear him humming, off-key, always the same 3 or 4 notes from some song he could never name. And by the time I finished the dishes, he'd be downstairs again in sweatpants, and we'd sit on the couch for 20 minutes before bed and talk about nothing in particular. Our version of nothing in particular being mostly Owen's baseball stats and whether Lily's ballet recital costume needed hemming. 16 years of Tuesdays like that. I could not have told you, before all of this happened, how many thousands of dinner plates I had washed while that man showered upstairs, humming his tuneless 3 notes. But I could have told you, with complete and total confidence, that I knew this man as well as I knew my own reflection. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for what comes later. Our marriage was not perfect in the years leading up to that Tuesday in March. I don't think any honest telling of 16 years can claim it was. We argued about money sometimes, mostly about whether we could afford to redo the bathroom upstairs that had been avocado green since the Reagan administration. We argued about his travel schedule, picking up over the last year or so, more trips to Columbus than there used to be, more late nights at the regional office that I chalked up, without a second thought, to Halden expanding its territory and Greg simply working harder to keep up with a job he took real pride in. We argued once, badly, about whether his mother should keep coming for 2 full weeks at Christmas instead of 1. These were the arguments of an ordinary marriage carrying the ordinary weight of 2 working parents and 2 kids and a roof that needed replacing. And I want to be very clear that nothing about them, not one single fight, prepared me in any way for what a stranger's voice told me on the other end of a phone I wasn't supposed to answer. Looking back now, with the particular clarity that only comes after you already know the ending, I can see there were things I should have noticed sooner. I can see them the way you can only ever see a pattern once someone hands you the key that unlocks it. Never before. But I want to walk through what I actually knew, in real time, in the months before that phone rang, because I think it's important, both for me and for anyone listening who is currently living inside a marriage they believe is solid, to understand exactly how normal, how boringly, forgivably normal, all of it looked from the inside. It started, though I did not know it started, in June of the year before, 9 months before the phone rang on that Tuesday. At the Halden Equipment Group's annual sales convention, 3 days at the Blackstone Hotel in downtown Columbus, a squat, elegant old building with a lobby full of dark wood and brass fixtures that I had actually visited once myself, years earlier, for a company holiday party back when spouses were still regularly invited to these things. Greg went every June. It was routine. Regional managers from 4 states gathering for keynote speeches about quarterly targets and forgettable dinners in hotel ballrooms. And I never thought twice about it. I helped him pack. I reminded him to bring the good Navy suit for the awards dinner. I kissed him goodbye in the driveway with Lily hanging off my hip, asking when Daddy would be home. He came home 3 days later, tired, a little sunburned from a group golf outing, full of the usual convention stories, which sales rep drank too much at the bar, which new product line the company was pushing, and one new detail that I registered and then filed away without a second thought, the way you file away 1,000 harmless details a week in a marriage, which was that the company had brought on a new account coordinator for the Columbus office, a woman named Vanessa, who Greg mentioned had actually briefly overlapped with him years earlier at a different company, before she'd left the industry for a while. Small world, he said. And I said something like, "That's nice," and passed him a plate of spaghetti. And that was the entire weight that sentence carried in our house for the next several months, less weight than a comment about the weather. I want to tell you now what I did not know then, what I only came to understand in painful, documented detail during the 6 weeks that followed that phone call, which is that Vanessa Reyes was 33 years old, that she had in fact briefly worked alongside Greg at a different equipment company 9 years earlier when she was just starting out, and he was already established, that nothing had happened between them then, not as far as I have ever been able to determine, but that something had clearly lingered. Some old current of attention neither of them had ever had reason to act on, and that her transfer into the Columbus office that same month and her seat at the same convention dinner table as my husband 3 days later reopened a door that had been sitting quietly ajar for almost a decade. I know now that they exchanged numbers that first night, ostensibly for work, that they sat next to each other at the Thursday dinner and talked for 2 hours while I was 300 miles away giving Lily a bath and helping Owen study for a spelling test. And I know now because I eventually saw the message logs myself, black and white and undeniable, that within 11 days of that convention they were texting every day, and within 6 weeks they had first slept together in a room at that same Blackstone hotel, during what Greg told me was a routine one-night account review trip. None of that reached me, not one particle of it. What reached me over the following 8 months were small, disconnected, entirely explainable changes that I absorbed the way you absorb the temperature of a room slowly warming, never once feeling the specific moment when it became too warm to stand. Greg started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, 3 days a week, which struck me, if I felt anything about it at all, as a nice thing, a healthy thing, a 44-year-old man taking his cardiologist's mild suggestions seriously for once. He started keeping his phone with him more, bringing it into the bathroom when he showered instead of leaving it on the nightstand, which I noticed exactly once, in passing, and attributed to a work email thread about a difficult client account he'd mentioned was keeping him up at night. He changed the passcode on his phone sometime in the fall, from Lily's birthday, which we'd used on every device in the house for years, to something he said was a random string his IT department at Halden was now requiring for security reasons after some vendor had a data breach, a plausible enough story that I never once asked to see the new number written down. His travel schedule to Columbus went from once a month to 2 or 3 times some months, always framed as a specific account issue, a client visit, a training session for new hires. And each individual trip had a name and a reason attached to it that made perfect sense on its own, the way each individual brick makes perfect sense sitting on top of the one before it. And it is only when you step back and look at the entire wall that you understand what's actually been built. I want to say something plainly because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not miss these signs because I was foolish or naive or willfully blind in some way that made me deserve what happened. I missed them because I trusted him, and because trust, real trust, the kind you build over 16 years of Tuesday dishes and hospital waiting rooms and a decade of shared mortgage payments, does not function like suspicion. It does not go looking for alternate explanations. It accepts the first reasonable one offered and moves on to the next item on a very long list of things a working mother of 2 has to hold in her head on any given day. And Greg, whatever else I now know to be true about him, was extremely good. Whether by practice or by some darker natural talent I never wanted to believe he had, at offering reasonable explanations. There was one moment, one single moment in those 8 months, that I did notice consciously enough to feel a small flicker of something, though I did not have a name for the feeling at the time and would not have one until March. It was a Sunday afternoon in January, cold, gray, the kind of Ohio winter day that presses down on you, and Greg was standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone with an expression on his face that I had genuinely never seen him wear before. Not annoyance, not boredom. Something softer and more private than either of those. Something that looked, if I am being completely honest with the benefit of everything I know now, like a man reading something that made him feel young. I asked him, half joking, "What's so interesting?" And he startled, actually physically startled, turned the phone face down against the counter in a motion so fast it knocked over Lily's juice cup and said, "Oh, nothing. Just something dumb Kevin sent me." Kevin being a coworker of his I had met exactly twice at company holiday parties, and I laughed it off, made a joke about him being jumpy, and we mopped up the juice together, and the moment passed, filed under nothing, the way everything got filed under nothing until the night a woman named Vanessa dialed the wrong number in her phone's contact list, and instead of reaching her friend Priya, reached the one person in the entire world she should never, under any circumstances, have reached. I stood in my kitchen for what felt like a very long time after that call ended, though when I checked later, it had actually been less than a minute, because the shower upstairs was still running, and Greg's tuneless humming had not yet stopped, and some animal part of my brain understood before the rest of me caught up that I had exactly this much time, the length of a shower, to decide who I was going to be when he came back downstairs. I set his phone back down on the counter in the exact spot he'd left it, screen facing the same direction, and I finished drying my hands on the towel, and I picked the wet plate back up out of the drying rack and dried it too, even though it was already dry, just to have something to do with my hands that wasn't shaking. I want to describe what I felt in that minute as precisely as I can, because I have thought about it more than almost anything else in my adult life. It was not yet grief. It was not yet rage. It was something colder and stranger than either of those, a kind of total, structural vertigo, the feeling of a floor you have walked across 10,000 times, suddenly, silently, giving way an inch beneath your feet, not collapsing, just confirming, with a small and terrible give, that it had never been quite as solid as you assumed. Greg came downstairs 11 minutes later in sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, toweling his hair, completely unaware, completely at ease, and picked his phone up off the counter, glanced at it out of habit, and I watched him. I watched his face with an attention I had genuinely never given it before in 16 years. And I saw him register the missed call notification. I saw the smallest possible flicker of something cross his features, there and gone, in under a second, and then he set the phone face down again and said, "Hey, you want to watch that show tonight? The one with the British detective," and I said sure. And I sat next to my husband on our couch for the next 50 minutes and watched a program about a fictional murder in a fictional English village, while a very real one was quietly beginning to take shape 3 feet away from me. And I said almost nothing, and he noticed almost nothing. And when he asked if I was tired, I said yes, and went up to bed early. And I lay in the dark next to him for 2 hours before he came up, staring at the ceiling, doing something I had never in my life had reason to do before, which was building a case. I made a decision that night, lying in the dark, that I have never once regretted, though I understand it is not the decision every woman would make, and I don't think there's a single right answer here. I think there's only the answer that matches who you actually are. I decided I was not going to confront Greg based on 4 seconds of a stranger's misdial. I decided this for 2 reasons, and I want to lay them out honestly because I think the reasoning matters more than the decision itself. The first reason was fear, plain and unglamorous. The fear that if I was wrong, if there was some explanation I couldn't yet see, I would have detonated my marriage over a wrong number and never be able to fully repair the damage of the accusation itself. The second reason, the one I trust more in hindsight, the one that I think actually reflects who I am as a person, was that I did not want to hand Greg the chance to construct a better lie. I understood with a clarity that surprised me that the moment I said anything, the moment I let him see that I knew something was wrong, he would have every incentive and every opportunity to get ahead of the story, to shape what I would eventually learn into whatever version cost him the least. If I said nothing, if I simply watched, I would see the truth moving on its own, unrehearsed, unmanaged, the way you only ever see the true shape of something when it doesn't know it's being observed. So I did nothing. I said nothing. I went to work the next morning and taught 26 9-year-olds about long division, and I came home and I made dinner, and I washed the dishes at 8:47 while Greg showered upstairs, humming his same 3 notes. And if you had been sitting in my kitchen that Wednesday night, you would have seen absolutely nothing different about our house, because that was the entire point. That was the discipline I imposed on myself, starting that very first night, to let my life look, from the outside, in front of my children, in front of Greg, in front of my own reflection in the bathroom mirror, exactly as unchanged as it had looked the day before, while underneath that surface I began building, slowly, methodically, over what I came to privately call the quiet weeks, a complete and undeniable record of what my marriage actually was. I want to explain what the quiet weeks were, because I think that phrase is going to matter for the rest of this story. The quiet weeks were the 6 weeks between that Tuesday phone call in March and the Saturday afternoon in May, when I finally sat my husband down in our living room with a folder of documents thick enough that it needed a rubber band around it. During those 6 weeks, I taught my class every single day. I packed lunches, I drove Owen to baseball practice, and sat in the bleachers cheering exactly as loudly as I always had. I hemmed the hem on Lily's recital costume. I slept, most nights, next to a man I now understood to be actively deceiving me, and I never once let my face show him what I knew, because every single night I didn't confront him was another night the evidence kept accumulating on its own, honest and unmanaged. And every single night I did confront him would have been the night the evidence stopped being honest, because from that moment on he would know I was watching. That is not the coldest thing I've ever done. I want to be honest about that too. It felt some nights unbearably cold, lying next to a man, letting him kiss me goodnight, listening to him fall asleep within minutes the way he always had. 16 years of that specific unbothered breathing pattern I could have picked out of 100 sleeping men, while I lay awake beside him, constructing piece by piece the legal and financial architecture of the end of our marriage. But I also came to believe, somewhere around the second week, that this coldness was not cruelty. It was the only form of self-respect available to me in a situation designed, by his choices and not mine, to make me feel like a fool. I was not going to be the last person in my own marriage to understand what was happening in it. Whatever else those 6 weeks cost me, they gave me that. The first thing I did, the very next morning, before I even left for work, was open an app called Life 360 on my phone, a family location tracker Greg himself had set up almost 5 years earlier, after a string of car break-ins in a neighboring subdivision had rattled both of us, framed at the time as a safety tool for the whole family, something to check on the kids once they started driving, something neither of us had thought about in years except as a small green icon buried on the second screen of our phones. I want to point out, because I have thought about this often since, that it was Greg's own idea, Greg's own app, Greg's own insistence 5 years ago that we should all be able to see each other's locations for safety. And it was that same app, quietly running in the background of a phone he never once thought to disable it on, that became the very first crack in the story he would eventually try to tell me. I scrolled back through the location history, which the app stored for 30 days, and I found, on a Thursday 2 weeks earlier, a supposed late meeting at the Halden Regional Office in Columbus that Greg had described to me at dinner as running until almost 10. An evening I remembered specifically because I'd kept a plate warm for him in the oven, and he'd come home smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize, which I had, at the time, attributed to some free sample at a hotel gift shop, one more brick I hadn't yet learned to see as part of a wall. The location history showed his car leaving the office parking lot at 6:18 that evening, not staying until 10, and traveling instead to an address in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, an apartment building, where it remained parked for just over 3 hours before returning to the office lot briefly and then heading home. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and my phone and a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I wrote the date, the time, and the address down in a plain black composition notebook I bought that same afternoon at the drugstore, specifically for this purpose, a notebook I kept afterward in the bottom of an old boot in the back of my closet, underneath a box of winter scarves, in a place I knew Greg would never in 100 years think to look. I want to describe the composition notebook itself for a moment, because it became, over 6 weeks, the physical vessel for the most important documentation of my life, more important in its way than our marriage certificate or the deed to our house, both of which suddenly felt like they belonged to a story that had already ended, even while we were both still living inside it. The cover was plain black speckled cardboard, the kind you'd buy for a kid's science class, 99 cents on a clearance rack, and I filled the first page with a single ruled line at the top that read simply, dates and addresses, and beneath it, in my own handwriting, growing steadier and more clinical with every entry as the weeks went on, a record that would eventually run to 11 full pages. The second entry came 4 days later, when I quietly went through 6 months of statements on our shared Chase Sapphire credit card, something I had genuine legal and practical right to do since my name was on the account, and found a pattern I had never once thought to look for because I had never once had reason to distrust the man whose name appeared next to mine on it. There were hotel charges, 5 of them over 8 months, each one small enough on its own to disappear into a category I'd always mentally filed as work travel, incidentals Halden would reimburse later, and each one, when I looked closely at the dates, corresponding to nights Greg had told me he was staying over in Columbus for a training session or an early morning client meeting the next day. 4 of the 5 charges were from the Blackstone Hotel downtown. The 5th was from a boutique hotel in Chicago I had never heard of, dated to a weekend 11 days earlier. The exact weekend, I realized, with a jolt that went through my whole chest, that matched the trip Vanessa had described on the phone, the one with the view of the lake, the one Greg had told me in real time, was a last-minute work conference he was frustrated about having to attend on such short notice. I remember sitting at that kitchen table with the credit card statement in one hand and my composition notebook in the other, doing math I did not want to do, and I want to walk through that math carefully because I did it obsessively, almost ritually in the weeks that followed, checking and rechecking it the way you check a stove burner you're almost certain you already turned off. If the affair had started at the June convention 9 months before that Tuesday phone call, and the Chicago trip had happened 11 days before I found the statement, that meant this had been going on, in some form, for the better part of a year, roughly 2/3 of it while I was going about my life within the same house, sleeping beside the same man, utterly unaware. 8 months. 30-some weeks. I tried some nights to count backward through our shared calendar, our family trips, Owen's baseball tournaments, Lily's dance recital in October, Thanksgiving at my mother's, Christmas morning, trying to figure out which of those days had happened underneath this other hidden calendar running silently alongside our real one. And I want to tell you honestly that this exercise never once made me feel better. And I did it anyway, dozens of times, because some part of me needed to understand the full shape of what had actually happened to my family before I could decide what to do about it. By the end of that first week of quiet investigation, I had 4 pages in the composition notebook. Dates, addresses, a cross-reference list of business trips against credit card charges, against a location history that did not, in 5 separate instances, match the story I had been told at my own kitchen table by the man who slept beside me every night. I had not yet found her name in writing anywhere. I had not yet seen a single photograph, but I had built in 7 days an unimpeachable record of my husband lying to me, repeatedly, specifically, and with what I can only describe as real skill. And I remember closing that notebook on the 7th night and sitting very still at the table for a long time, and understanding, with a kind of grim, settled clarity, that whatever I found in the weeks ahead, I was no longer investigating whether something was wrong. I was only investigating how large it was. The bracelet is what turned this from a private investigation into something I could no longer carry alone. It happened on a Saturday, the 9th day of the quiet weeks, when Greg asked me to pick up his good gray suit from the dry cleaner on my way back from the grocery store, because he needed it for a Halden Regional Managers Dinner the following Thursday, an errand I had run 100 times before without a single thought. And the cleaner handed me the suit on its hanger in the usual plastic sheeting, and I noticed, out of nothing more than habit, that the inside breast pocket had a small weight to it, a little heavier than an empty pocket should be, and I reached in expecting a receipt or a stray pen, and instead my fingers closed around a small velvet drawstring pouch. I sat in the parking lot of that dry cleaner for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 10 minutes. Engine off, my own grocery bags wilting in the back seat, and I opened the pouch and found a delicate white gold bracelet, a thin chain with a small charm shaped like an airplane, and when I turned it over under the parking lot's fluorescent light, I saw 2 letters engraved on the inside of the clasp, small, elegant script, the letters V.R. I did not know her full name yet, not for certain, not until 3 days later when I finally let myself do the thing I'd been avoiding out of some instinct towards self-protection, which was searching Vanessa Reyes, Halden Equipment Group, Columbus, into a search engine on the browser at the public library on the other side of town. A library I chose deliberately because it was nowhere near my usual routes, and because some part of me did not want this search to exist on any device inside my own house. It took less than 4 minutes to find her LinkedIn photo, her public Instagram account, which I want to note plainly was never once set to private in 8 months, an oversight on her part that turned out to matter enormously to everything that followed. 33 years old, account coordinator at Halden Equipment Group's Columbus office, a profile full of the ordinary texture of somebody's life, brunch photos, a dog named Biscuit, a close group of girlfriends, including one tagged repeatedly as Priya Patel, the same Priya whose number Vanessa had been trying to reach the night she dialed my house instead. And there, scattered among 8 months of otherwise unremarkable posts, were the photographs that turned every entry in my composition notebook from a suspicion into a certainty. A photo geotagged Chicago, dated the exact weekend of the hotel charge I'd found on our chase statement. A glass of white wine held up against a floor-to-ceiling window with a lake view behind it. No caption, just 3 water emoji. Posted at 9:47 in the evening on a Friday, I had believed my husband was stuck in a hotel conference room, reviewing quarterly numbers with people whose names I could have listed for you at the time. A second photo, 4 months earlier, geotagged the Blackstone Hotel in Columbus, a room service tray with 2 coffee cups, one clearly a man's larger mug, captioned only with a single sun emoji. Posted at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, my husband had told me, in our own kitchen. Over our own dinner table was an early breakfast meeting with a difficult client account. I sat at that library computer, printing pages to a coin-operated printer at the front desk, with hands that had gone almost completely numb, and I understood, looking at a stranger's dog photos and brunch captions, that I was looking at the visual timeline of the collapse of my marriage, posted in real time for anyone to see, by a woman who had no idea the wife was watching, because the wife, until 3 weeks ago, hadn't known there was anything to watch for. That same week, I made 2 decisions that I do not regret, though both of them felt enormous at the time. Both of them felt like crossing a line I could not uncross. I called a divorce attorney named Patricia Nolan, whose name I found through a coworker's cousin, careful to use a number that would not show up on our shared family phone plan, and I sat across from her in an office on the 3rd floor of a building downtown I'd walked past 1,000 times without ever once looking up at it, and I told her everything: the phone call, the notebook, the bracelet, the Instagram photos, and she listened without a flicker of surprise, the calm of a woman who had clearly heard some version of this story more times than I wanted to imagine. And she told me something I have held on to ever since, which was, Melissa, the women who come to me too early usually walk away with nothing, and the women who come to me too late usually walk away exhausted. You are, if I'm being honest, exactly on time. Document everything. Don't confront him yet. And if you want real proof, the kind that holds up if this gets ugly, you should think about a private investigator. That is how I found Frank Delgado, a retired county sheriff's deputy turned private investigator who Patricia had worked with on a dozen cases before mine. A heavy-set, unhurried man in his early 60s who met me for our first conversation at a coffee shop 2 towns over and asked me exactly 4 questions before he ever quoted me a price. What car does he drive? What does he tell you when he travels? Do you know the other woman's address? Do you want photographs, or do you just want confirmation? I told him I wanted photographs because some cold, steady part of me already understood that Greg was going to try to talk his way out of whatever I eventually put in front of him, the way he had talked his way out of 100 smaller things over 16 years of marriage, and I was not going to give him room to talk his way out of this. Frank Delgado worked for 2 weeks, the 3rd and 4th weeks of the quiet weeks, and he called me every few days from a number I'd saved under a fake contact name, Dana's Hair Salon, in case Greg ever glanced at my phone, which he never did, because Greg had never once had reason to suspect that the surveillance in our marriage might run in both directions. Frank's reports were plain, procedural, almost clinical in a way that I found strangely steadying after weeks of doing this alone, with nothing but a composition notebook and my own racing thoughts. He confirmed over those 2 weeks 3 separate meetings between Greg and Vanessa Reyes. The first was a lunch on a Wednesday at a restaurant near the Halden Columbus office, which on its own would have meant very little. 2 colleagues eating lunch, except that Frank's photographs showed Greg's hand resting over Vanessa's on the table for the better part of 11 minutes, and showed them leaving separately, 3 minutes apart, through different doors, the practiced choreography of 2 people who had clearly done this before and knew exactly how to avoid being seen together by anyone who might recognize either of them. The second was an evening at the Blackstone Hotel, the same hotel from the June convention, the same hotel from 4 of the 5 charges on our chase statement, where Frank photographed Greg's car entering the parking garage at 6:40 in the evening and photographed, through a long lens from a public parking spot across the street, Greg and Vanessa exiting an elevator together on the lobby camera angle he'd positioned himself to catch, walking toward a bank of guest room elevators with the specific, unhurried familiarity of 2 people who were not first-time visitors to that particular routine. Greg's car did not leave the garage again until 11:15 that night, 4.5 hours later, on an evening he had told me, over the phone at 6:30, that he was staying late at the office to finish a proposal and would probably just crash in Columbus rather than drive the 90 minutes home tired. The third, and the one that finally closed every possible door I might have unconsciously left open for some innocent explanation, was a Sunday afternoon. 11 days into Frank's surveillance, when Greg told me he was driving up to Columbus for what he called a rare Sunday planning session with 2 other regional managers ahead of a big client pitch, and Frank instead photographed him arriving, alone, at an apartment building in the Short North neighborhood, the same building whose address had been the very first entry in my composition notebook 3 weeks earlier. The address the Life 360 app had shown his car parked at for 3 hours on an evening he'd told me was a late meeting. Frank photographed Greg being let in through the building's front door by a woman matching Vanessa Reyes's photographs exactly, and photographed him leaving 4 hours later, and in between, using entirely legal means that Patricia Nolan had walked me through carefully beforehand, obtained records showing that unit belonged to a tenant named Vanessa Reyes. Lease signed 8 months earlier, the same month the affair, according to everything else I now knew, had actually begun. I met Frank one final time at the end of those 2 weeks, at the same coffee shop 2 towns over, and he slid a manila envelope across the table to me, thick, heavier than I expected, and he said in the same unhurried, unemotional voice he'd used every time we spoke, "I'm sorry it's this clear, Mrs. Corwin. Sometimes it isn't. This time it is. I want to tell you that I did not cry in that coffee shop, though I fully expected to, and instead I felt something closer to a strange, hollow calm, the calm of a diagnosis finally confirmed after weeks of frightening, ambiguous symptoms, the specific relief of no longer having to wonder. I paid Frank the remainder of his fee, thanked him, and drove home with that envelope on the passenger seat of my car, like it was something radioactive. And that night, for the first time in 3 weeks, I slept 9 straight hours without once waking up to check the time. Over the following 10 days, working mostly after the kids were asleep and Greg was traveling, which by now I understood the real schedule of far better than he realized I did, I assembled everything into a single binder. The location history printouts, the credit card statements with the relevant charges highlighted in yellow, the bracelet in its velvet pouch, photographed and then placed in a small Ziploc bag, the printed Instagram photos with dates cross-referenced against Greg's own explanations, which I'd written out from memory in a second notebook, word for word as best I could recall them, the difficult client account, the last-minute conference in Chicago, the Sunday planning session with 2 other regional managers who, Patricia's paralegal confirmed through a simple phone call to Halden's Columbus office, had not in fact been in Columbus that particular Sunday at all, and Frank's photographs, 22 of them in total, Time-stamped, addressed, undeniable. The visual record of 8 months compressed into a single rubber-banded folder, an inch and a half thick, that I kept for the final week before the confrontation. Not in the boot in my closet anymore, but in the trunk of my own car, because some instinct told me that whatever else happened, this particular piece of evidence needed to exist. Somewhere Greg could never accidentally find it, and somewhere I could reach in under 2 minutes if I ever needed it in a hurry. I called it privately in my own head the dossier, and I want to admit something uncomfortable about the week I spent finishing it, which is that assembling it felt, at moments, less like grief and more like work, the specific satisfaction of a well-organized project coming together, tabs labeled, dates lined up, a clean chronological case built the way I imagined a good prosecutor built one, and I have thought about that feeling often since. The strange fact that my brain, faced with the total collapse of the life I'd built, reached first not for despair, but for order, because order was the one thing that remained entirely within my control. I did not carry the quiet weeks entirely alone, and I want to talk about that, because I think the version of this story where a woman handles something like this in total isolation, saying nothing to a single living soul, is either a lie or a tragedy, and I did not want to live either one. 4 days after the phone call, unable to hold the entire weight of it by myself for one more day, I told my closest friend, a fellow teacher at Jefferson Elementary named Dana Whitfield, who taught second grade 2 doors down from my classroom and who I had eaten lunch with at the same corner table in the teacher's lounge for 11 years. I told her over coffee at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning while both our husbands, hers a genuinely decent man named Marcus, who coached Pop Warner football, took all 4 of our combined kids to a movie. And I watched Dana's face move through disbelief and then fury, and then a kind of fierce, focused calm that I badly needed someone else to model for me, because I did not yet know how to feel that way about my own life. Dana asked me the question I had been avoiding asking myself in quite those terms, which was, what do you actually want out of this, Melissa? Do you want him to stop, or do you want out? Because those are different projects, and you're going to need to know which one you're running before you confront him. I remember sitting with that question for a long time, longer than felt comfortable at her kitchen table, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that some mornings I woke up thinking about 18 years and 2 children and a mortgage, and wanting more than anything for there to be some version of this where we survived it, and other mornings, usually after finding some new detail, some new lie stacked on an older lie, I woke up wanting nothing more than to be as far away from Gregory Corwin as the state of Ohio would allow. Dana didn't push me toward either answer, which I have always been grateful for, she simply said. Then build the case first and decide after, because you can't make a real decision with half the facts, and whatever you decide, you deserve to decide it standing on solid ground instead of guessing. Dana became, over those 6 weeks, the one person who knew everything in real time. The person I called from my car in the school parking lot after finding the bracelet. The person who sat with me on the phone for 2 hours the night I printed the Instagram photos at the library. The person who reminded me, more than once, to eat something on days when the sheer administrative weight of documenting my own husband's affair had crowded actual meals out of my schedule entirely. She never once told me what to do. She only ever helped me see more clearly what I was already choosing, one quiet decision at a time. And I think that is the single most valuable thing a friend can offer someone living inside a slow-motion catastrophe. Not answers, but company steady enough that you don't lose your own reflection in the noise. By the final week of April, 6 weeks after the phone call, with the dossier complete and sitting in the trunk of my car, I began the last piece of preparation, which was entirely logistical, and which I now recognize looking back as the moment the quiet weeks tipped over into something more deliberate, something closer to planning an operation than simply gathering facts. I opened a checking account in my name alone at a different bank than the one Greg and I had always used, seeding it quietly, $100 at a time, from my own teaching paycheck over 3 separate weeks, so there would be no unusual transfer for him to notice on our shared account. I made photocopies of our tax returns, our mortgage documents, the deed to the house, Owen's and Lily's birth certificates and social security cards, and stored them at Dana's house rather than my own in a fireproof lockbox she kept in her basement for exactly this kind of situation. Because Patricia Nolan had told me, plainly, that women in my position sometimes discovered important documents had gone missing the moment their husbands sensed a confrontation coming, and I was not going to let that happen to me. I also began, carefully, to plan the confrontation itself, choosing the first Saturday in May specifically because it was the one weekend that month my mother, Carol Ashby, who lived across town and adored her grandchildren with an intensity that had only grown since my father passed 6 years earlier, had already offered, weeks in advance and for entirely unrelated reasons, to take Owen and Lily for a sleepover so I could, in her words, get some rest for once. I remember calling her the Wednesday before, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, and asking if that offer still stood, and she said, "Of course, sweetheart, everything okay," and I told her, which was not exactly a lie, that Greg and I needed to talk through some things about his work travel, and I didn't want the kids underfoot. And she said, in the easy, trusting voice of a woman who had no idea her daughter's marriage was about to end at her own kitchen table 2 days later, "Take all the time you need, Melissa. We'll have a wonderful time." I packed the kids' overnight bags myself that Friday night, humming, I remember, some song I couldn't name. And it was only as I zipped Lily's bag closed, tucking in her worn stuffed rabbit and a spare pair of tights for ballet practice the following week, that I let myself cry for the first time in nearly 6 weeks. Not loudly, not for long, just 5 minutes sitting on the edge of my daughter's bed with her rabbit in my lap, grieving in advance for the version of her childhood that was about to change in ways she did not yet understand, before I wiped my face, put the rabbit back exactly where it belonged, and went downstairs to make dinner like it was any other Friday night in the life of our family. The first Saturday in May was warm and bright in a way that felt almost insulting, the kind of early spring afternoon that in any other year would have had all 4 of us in the backyard, Greg grilling something, the kids running through the sprinkler despite the water still being cold enough to make them shriek. I dropped Owen and Lily at my mother's house at 11 that morning, and I remember Owen already halfway distracted by his phone in the back seat and Lily asking, with the particular perceptiveness of a 10-year-old who notices when a coaster has moved 2 inches, why I looked like I did, and I told her I was just tired, and she accepted that the way children accept most things adults tell them, provisionally, without full conviction, filing it away the way I once filed away a phone left face down on a counter. I came home at 11:40, and Greg was in the garage, tinkering with something on his golf clubs, wholly unaware that the woman walking toward him across our driveway had spent 6 weeks turning their entire marriage into an 11-page notebook and a rubber-banded folder currently sitting on the coffee table inside, where I'd placed it 20 minutes earlier while he was still in the garage. I asked him to come inside, that we needed to talk about something, and I want to describe his face in that moment honestly, because there was nothing on it yet, no fear, no guilt, just the mild, distracted curiosity of a man who assumed his wife wanted to discuss summer vacation plans or a leaking gutter. We sat down in the living room, him in his usual armchair, me on the edge of the couch across from him, and I did not raise my voice, not once, through the entire hour and 40 minutes that followed, because I had decided weeks earlier, lying awake beside him, that I was not going to give him the version of this conversation where he could later tell himself, or anyone else, that his wife had simply had an emotional overreaction to a wrong number. I said, "Greg, a woman named Vanessa called your phone by mistake 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday while you were in the shower, and she thought she was talking to her friend Priya, and she told me about a trip to Chicago and a hotel room with a view of the lake, and I have spent 6 weeks finding out everything else." I watched him. I want you to understand I watched him the way I imagine a scientist watches an experiment they already know the outcome of, because I did already know the outcome. And what I was watching for now was simply which version of the truth he would choose to try on first. His face went through 3 distinct stages in under 10 seconds, and I have had a year now to think about how to describe them. The first was a kind of total physical stillness, a held breath, the look of a man doing frantic arithmetic behind his eyes. The second, and this is the one that still makes something in my chest go cold when I remember it, was an attempt, a genuine, deliberate attempt. At confusion, at denial, he said, "Melissa, I don't know what you're talking about. What call?" And I let him say it. I let him get 2 more sentences deep into a story about a coworker named Vanessa, who he barely knew, before I reached down to the coffee table and set the folder in front of him and untied the rubber band and simply began laying items on the table between us, one at a time, in the exact order I had rehearsed in my head more times than I could count. The location history printout from the Short North apartment, dated and time-stamped. The chase statement with the Blackstone Hotel, charges highlighted in yellow. The bracelet in its Ziploc bag with the engraved initials turned face up. The printed Instagram photo of the lake view in Chicago. The date beneath it, circled in red pen. And finally, without a word, Frank Delgado's photographs, the lunch, the hotel elevator, the apartment building door, laid out in a neat row like a hand of cards nobody could argue with. I did not say anything while I did this. I let the silence do the talking, the way I had let silence do the talking 6 weeks earlier, while a stranger's voice unraveled everything on the other end of a phone call that was never meant for me. The third stage on Greg's face, once he understood there was nothing left to deny, was something I can only describe as a kind of collapse from the inside, his shoulders coming down, his face going slack in a way I had genuinely never seen in 16 years of marriage, and he put both hands over his face and said, muffled, "Broken? God, Melissa, I'm so sorry." And I remember feeling in that exact moment almost nothing at all, a strange, flat calm, because I had already grieved this specific moment 100 times over the previous 6 weeks, and there was very little left in me for it to detonate. He talked for a long time after that, and I let him. Partly because Patricia had told me it was useful to hear everything he was willing to say, while the shock was still working against his instinct to manage the narrative, and partly because some smaller, more human part of me still wanted, even then, to understand. He told me it started at the June convention, which matched everything I already knew. He told me it wasn't about me, which is the sentence I think almost every unfaithful spouse reaches for, as though that framing is supposed to be comforting rather than simply another way of centering himself in a story about the 2 people he'd hurt most. He told me he had tried to end it twice, in the fall and again around the holidays, and both times Vanessa had reached out again, and he hadn't had, in his words, the strength to stay away. And I asked him, in the only moment in that entire conversation where my voice actually shook, whether it had occurred to him, even once, in 8 months, that he had a wife at home doing math on the kitchen table trying to figure out how to afford a new roof, and he had no answer for that, none. And the silence that followed was the longest one of the entire afternoon. I told him, once he'd said everything he seemed capable of saying, that I was not interested in trying to save the marriage. Not that day, not yet, possibly not ever, and that I had already retained an attorney, and that I expected him to be out of the house within the month, and that whatever happened between us going forward, our children came first, every single time without exception, starting immediately. He asked quietly if there was any chance at all, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know yet, but that the chance, if it existed at all, was not something he could rebuild in an afternoon of crying in our living room. It was something that would have to be earned, slowly, over months, with total transparency, and that I was not going to make any promises about the outcome while I was still this raw. I picked up my folder, retied the rubber band, and went to pick up my children from my mother's house, and I remember driving there with the windows down despite the chill, needing the air, needing to arrive at my mother's door as close to myself as I could manage before I had to look my son and my daughter in the eyes again. I want to go back to that Saturday afternoon in May for a moment, because I skipped over something in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation that I think matters. The specific strange hour I spent alone in my house between Greg going quiet in his armchair and me driving to pick up Owen and Lily from my mother's. He asked before I left whether he should be there when the kids came home, and I told him no, not that day, that I needed one evening to figure out how to be in the same house as him without our children present before I figured out how to do it with them present too. And he nodded and said he'd stay at a motel off the highway that night, the first of what would become, over the following weeks, an increasingly regular arrangement before he found his own apartment in June. After he left, I walked through our house alone for a while, room by room, in a kind of daze I had not fully anticipated, even after 6 weeks of preparing for this exact day. I stood in the kitchen where I'd washed dishes every Tuesday for 16 years. I stood in the living room where the folder had just sat open on the coffee table, where I could still see the faint indentations in the couch cushion where Greg had been sitting with his face in his hands. I went upstairs and stood in Owen's doorway, looking at his baseball trophies lined up on a shelf we'd built together 3 summers earlier, and in Lily's doorway, looking at the pencil marks on the closet doorframe that charted 8 years of her height. And I understood, standing in those 2 doorways, that whatever else this day had done to my marriage, my actual job, starting the next morning and continuing for the rest of my life, was making sure that neither of those 2 rooms and the 2 children who slept in them absorbed 1 ounce more damage from this than was absolutely unavoidable. I called Patricia Nolan from my car in the driveway before I left to get the kids, mostly because she'd asked me to check in immediately after the conversation happened, and I gave her a brief summary, and she said calmly, "You did exactly what we discussed. You let him talk first, you didn't raise your voice, you didn't make any promises about reconciliation you'd regret later. That's a clean foundation to build the rest of this on." I remember hearing that, a strange kind of pride that surprised me given how raw everything else felt, the specific pride of having executed a difficult thing carefully rather than emotionally. And I want to be honest that this pride coexisted, uncomfortably but completely, with a grief so large I could feel it sitting on my chest like a physical weight the entire drive to my mother's house. My mother took one look at my face when I arrived and did not ask a single question in front of the children, simply hugged me a beat longer than usual at the door and said quietly in my ear, "We'll talk later. Go get some rest tonight." And I loaded Owen and Lily into the car, both of them full of stories about the pancakes Grandma had made for dinner, a family tradition of hers that always delighted them. Breakfast food at night, and I drove them home and put them to bed in their own rooms, in the same house, under the same roof that had, technically, legally, financially, irrevocably changed that very afternoon, in ways neither of them yet understood. And I sat on the floor of the hallway between their 2-bedroom doors for almost an hour after they fell asleep, not crying anymore by that point, just breathing, just being present in the specific quiet architecture of the family I was now going to have to rebuild into something smaller and different. And I remember thinking, sitting there in the dark hallway, that this, exactly this, sitting quietly between my children's doors, making sure they were safe and asleep, was the one part of my life that the entire previous 6 weeks had never once put at risk, because it had never once depended on Gregory Corwin to begin with. The weeks that followed the confrontation were, in some ways, harder than the 6 weeks that preceded it, because the quiet weeks at least had the strange mercy of forward motion, each day bringing some new piece of the picture into focus, while the weeks after felt like standing still inside wreckage, deciding over and over what to do with each piece. Greg did not move out immediately. He slept in the guest room for the first 10 days, and I want to be honest that this arrangement, my own choice, made partly for the children's sake, and partly because Patricia had advised against anyone leaving the marital home too abruptly before certain legal and financial steps were finalized, was one of the strangest periods of my entire life, sharing a house, sharing dinners some nights for the kids' sake, with a man I now understood in a completely different way than I had 6 weeks earlier. I told Owen and Lily during the second week, sitting them down together on a Sunday afternoon, using language Patricia's paralegal had actually helped me draft in advance, careful, age-appropriate, entirely free of blame directed at either parent in front of them, even though every word of it cost me something to say evenly. I told them that Mommy and Daddy loved them exactly as much as we always had, and that would never change, that adults sometimes made choices that meant they couldn't stay married anymore, that this had nothing to do with anything either of them had done or not done, and that Daddy would be finding his own place to live soon but would see them all the time. Owen, 14 and already old enough to sense there was more beneath the careful sentences than either of us was saying, asked quietly, "Is this because of that woman Kevin mentioned once?" And I felt something in my chest go still, understanding that my son had picked up some fragment of overheard adult conversation months earlier and filed it away exactly the way I had once filed away Greg's own small inconsistencies. And I told him, honestly, that grown-up problems in a marriage were complicated, and it wasn't his job to sort out the details, only to know that both his parents loved him without any conditions attached. Lily cried, hard, for 20 minutes, and then asked if she could still have her birthday party at the house in July, and I told her absolutely, yes, of course, and something about the specific, practical, 10-year-old nature of that question broke my heart and steadied it at almost exactly the same time. Greg tried, in those first weeks, harder than I expected him to reconcile. He brought home flowers twice, which I asked him to stop doing, gently but firmly, because I did not want our children seeing gestures that implied a resolution I had not agreed to. He asked more than once if we could see a marriage counselor together, and I told him I was open to individual counseling for myself, which I began attending every Thursday evening starting in late May, but that I was not ready for couples counseling because I did not yet know if I was working toward reconciliation or working toward an ending, and I did not want to muddy that decision with a process designed around the assumption we were staying together. I want to say plainly that there were nights in May and June when I genuinely did not know which direction I was leaning. Nights when 18 years of history pulled hard against 6 weeks of documented betrayal. And I do not think there is anything dishonest or weak about that uncertainty. I think it is simply what it actually feels like to be a human being deciding whether to end the central relationship of your adult life. What ultimately settled it for me, more than any single dramatic moment, was something quieter that happened in the middle of June, about 6 weeks after the confrontation. I discovered, entirely by accident, checking our shared email for an insurance document, that Greg had texted Vanessa Reyes twice in the 2 weeks immediately following our confrontation, not to arrange anything. His messages made that much clear, but simply, in his own words, to check that she was doing okay with everything, framed as concern for a person he'd hurt, a sentiment that might have moved me under different circumstances, but that instead told me, with total finality, that some part of him was still tending to that connection, even while telling me every single day that he wanted nothing more than to save our marriage. I confronted him about it calmly, and he did not deny it. He said he felt guilty about how abruptly things had ended for her too, and I remember sitting across from him at our own kitchen table, the same table where I had once done anxious math about a new roof, and understanding, finally, completely, without a shred of remaining doubt, that I was not going to spend the next 20 years wondering whether some part of my husband's attention still lived in an apartment in the short north neighborhood of Columbus. I told him I wanted him to move out by the end of the month, and this time I meant it as an ending rather than a threat, and he heard the difference in my voice, and he did not argue. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment near the Halden Regional Office in Columbus in the last week of June, a location I noted, with a bitterness I am not proud of but also will not pretend I didn't feel, that put him roughly 11 minutes from the short north apartment where Frank Delgado had photographed him a little over 2 months earlier. In July, Greg left Halden Equipment Group entirely, taking a position with a competing distributor also based in Columbus, a move he framed to me during one of our now scheduled bi-weekly conversations about the kids' logistics as wanting a fresh start, Though I have always privately believed it had at least as much to do with the fact that word of the affair had, inevitably, in the particular small world way these things travel through a regional sales office, made its way around Halden's Columbus building and working every day in a place where colleagues now knew exactly what he'd done, had apparently become its own kind of unbearable. I did not ask, and he did not offer, whether he and Vanessa Reyes were still involved once he was free to be, and I want to be honest that some part of me still does not know the answer to that question, and has made a deliberate, ongoing choice not to find out, because Frank Delgado's dossier had already told me everything about my marriage that I needed to know, and anything after that belonged to a chapter of my life I was no longer a character in. The legal separation became official in August, 3 months after the confrontation, 5 months after the phone call that started all of it. And I want to walk through that process honestly because I think the version of divorce people imagine from movies, dramatic courtroom shouting matches, rarely resembles the actual experience, which is mostly paperwork, waiting rooms, and a series of small, exhausting negotiations conducted through attorneys because the two people involved can no longer trust themselves to negotiate directly without old wounds reopening. Patricia Nolan filed the separation agreement in the first week of August, and Greg's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Robert Felt, who I met exactly twice across a conference table and never once outside of that context, responded a week later with a counter that revealed the one area where Greg and I were genuinely, bitterly going to disagree, which was not, as I had expected, the house or the retirement accounts, but the custody schedule. Greg wanted, according to Felt's initial proposal, a 50-50 week-on, week-off arrangement, and I understood immediately, sitting in Patricia's office reading through it, that this was not primarily about Greg's devotion to shared parenting, real as I believe that devotion to be, but at least partly about guilt, about a man trying to prove to himself and to everyone watching that he had not actually broken anything essential, that the children's lives could simply toggle between two houses without real disruption. I did not want a week-on, week-off arrangement, and I fought it. Harder than I fought almost anything else in the entire process, not out of spite, but because I genuinely believed, watching Owen's grades dip slightly that fall and watching Lily start asking, some nights, whether she could sleep in my bed instead of hers, that both kids needed one stable primary home during a year that had already upended enough of their sense of stability, with their father close by and deeply present rather than administratively equal. We went through 4 months of mediation, September through December, sitting across a table from each other with a court-appointed mediator named Susan Illich, a patient. No-nonsense woman in her 50s who had clearly navigated 1,000 versions of exactly this fight before. And I want to describe one specific session in November because it was the closest the entire process came to genuinely ugly, the kind of moment where 18 years of history and 5 months of grief nearly overwhelmed the careful procedural calm both attorneys had worked hard to maintain in that room. Greg, frustrated after weeks of proposals and counter-proposals, said, more sharply than I had ever heard him speak in 16 years of marriage, that I was punishing him by keeping the kids from him, that I was using Owen and Lily as leverage, the way, he said, I'd used the private investigator as leverage, and I felt something in me go very cold and very still, and I said, evenly, in a voice I did not know I still had access to after everything, Greg, I have never once told either of our children a single negative word about you. I have driven them to your apartment for every visit on time. I have never missed a call, and the only leverage in this room is the 8 months you spent building a second life while I built ours. And Susan Illich, to her enormous credit, let that silence sit for a long moment before quietly redirecting us both back to the actual proposal on the table. We settled, in December, on a schedule that gave Greg the children every other weekend and 1 weeknight dinner each week, with primary residence remaining with me. A compromise that satisfied neither of us completely, which Patricia told me, with the dry, practiced honesty I'd come to rely on, was usually the sign of a fair outcome rather than an unfair one. We divided the house, which I kept, refinancing the mortgage in my name alone, with help from a modest inheritance from my father that I had, fortunately, kept separate in its own account throughout our entire marriage. One of the only financially fortunate decisions in this whole story that I can take no credit for, since it had simply been my late father's specific instruction in his will. Greg kept his retirement accounts largely intact in exchange for a larger share of the marital savings coming to me, and the entire financial settlement, once both attorneys had finished their careful, unglamorous work, came out close enough to what Patricia had projected in our very first meeting back in April that I remember feeling, reading the final paperwork in her office, less triumph than something quieter, a kind of exhausted relief, the feeling of finally setting down a suitcase you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten your arm could hang, naturally, at your side. The divorce itself was finalized the following February, 11 months after the confrontation in our living room, just 3 weeks shy of the 1-year anniversary of the phone call that started everything. Close enough to that anniversary that I noticed it, that I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot after the brief, almost anticlimactic final hearing and did the math without meaning to. June to March was 9 months of a secret. March to May was 6 weeks of quiet investigation. May to February was 9 months of paperwork and mediation, and the slow, unglamorous architecture of ending a life 2 people had spent 16 years building together. And the total distance from the moment a stranger's voice said my own name back to me on a misdialed phone call to the moment a judge's signature made it all officially, legally over, came out to just under 12 months, a single calendar year that had rearranged absolutely everything I thought I knew about my own life. I want to go back now and tell you something I did not learn until much later, months after the divorce was already final. Because I think it belongs in this story, even though I did not have access to it while I was living through the quiet weeks, and because I think it changes the shape of the whole thing in a way that surprised me. I learned it from Dana, who heard it from her husband Marcus, who had, through the strange small-town connective tissue that links every mid-sized city's business community together in ways you don't notice until you need them, a cousin who worked in a different department at Halden's Columbus office, and who had, apparently, watched the entire affair unfold from a slight remove for months before any of it reached me. According to what filtered back to me, secondhand, months after I no longer had any real use for the information except to complete a picture I'd already accepted, Vanessa Reyes had, in fact, told at least 2 friends at the Columbus office early on that she knew Greg was married, that she'd asked him directly at the June convention whether his marriage was solid, and that he had told her, and I want to repeat this precisely because I think it matters, he had told her that his marriage was essentially over in every way that counted, that he and his wife were, in his words, more like roommates raising kids together than a real couple, that we hadn't been intimate in any meaningful sense in over a year, and that he was already planning to leave once the kids were a little older and could handle it better. Every single word of that was false. Every word of it. We had not been the passionate, giddy newlyweds we once were. No marriage 16 years and 2 children deep ever entirely is. But we were not roommates. We were not sexless. We were not quietly waiting out some predetermined expiration date. And I want to be completely honest that learning this, months after the fact, from a secondhand account I could never fully verify, was in some ways more disorienting than anything I'd found in the 6 weeks of the actual investigation. Because it meant Greg had not simply been caught in a moment of weakness at a hotel bar. He had constructed, deliberately, a false narrative of our entire marriage and handed it to another human being as the moral permission slip that let both of them feel, however briefly, like they weren't doing anything so terrible after all. I do not know, and will never know with certainty, whether Vanessa believed that story fully or believed it enough to let herself stop asking questions, or simply wanted to believe it badly enough that the details stopped mattering to her the way they should have. I have thought about this more than I probably should, given that she is, at the end of the day, a woman I have never once spoken to directly, and likely never will. Patricia advised me firmly against any contact with her, both for legal reasons during the divorce proceedings and for what Patricia, gently but plainly, called my own long-term peace of mind. And I took that advice, though there were nights, especially in the fall, when the anger had nowhere else productive to go, that I drafted messages to her in my head that I never sent, that I never even wrote down, message after message asking her, essentially, did you know? Did you ask? Did any part of you wonder about the wife back home doing math on a kitchen table? I settled eventually, somewhere around the 1-year mark, on an answer that I do not know is true, but that I have chosen to live inside because it is the only answer that lets me put this particular question down, which is that it does not actually matter what Vanessa Reyes knew or didn't know, believed or didn't believe, because the vows, the promises, the 16 years of Tuesday dishes, all of that belonged to Greg and me, not to her, and the person who broke something sacred was never a coworker who misdialed a phone number. It was the man who had been building a second, secret version of our marriage for 8 months, brick by brick, lie by specific, detailed lie, while eating dinner at our kitchen table every single night and letting our children climb into his lap afterward like nothing in the entire architecture of their family was cracking beneath them. I want to also be fair, in a way that took me most of the year to arrive at, about what I now understand of Vanessa's own situation, because Dana's secondhand information included one more detail that I found, against every instinct I had, strangely humanizing rather than infuriating. Apparently, once it became clear across the Columbus office that the affair had come to light, that Greg's wife had found out in dramatic fashion, that Greg had left the company entirely a month later, Vanessa faced a version of consequence too, quieter than mine but real in its own way. Whispered conversations in break rooms, a coordinator role that suddenly felt smaller. Once colleagues who'd liked her started keeping a careful, polite distance. A reputation in a specific professional community that does not forget easily. I do not feel sorry for her. Exactly. And I want to be honest that I don't think I owe her that feeling. But I also stopped, sometime last spring, needing to imagine her suffering in order to feel like justice had been served, because I came to understand that the actual justice I needed had never been about her at all. It was about the version of my own life I built afterward, entirely independent of whether a woman 300 miles away ever faced a single consequence for anything. I want to tell you about the closest I came, in the entire year, to changing my mind, because I think leaving it out would make this story smaller and less honest than it actually was. It happened in September, 4 months after the confrontation on Owen's 14th birthday, at a small backyard gathering I had agonized over for weeks. Whether to invite Greg, whether his presence would comfort our son, or simply remind everyone in the yard of exactly what had broken. And I decided, in the end, that Owen's birthday belonged to Owen and not to my own unresolved feelings. So Greg came, and he brought a new baseball glove Owen had been wanting for months. And I watched my son's face light up in a way it genuinely had not lit up since March. And something in my chest ached with a complicated, unwelcome tenderness I was not prepared for. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and Greg was helping me carry folding chairs back into the garage, purely practical, purely logistical, he said quietly, watching Owen and a friend toss the new glove back and forth in the fading light. I miss this, Melissa. Not us fighting about the mediation schedule. This, just being a family in a backyard on a Tuesday. And I stood there with a folding chair in my hands and felt something genuinely dangerous move through me. A pull backward toward 18 years of shared history that no amount of documentation in a composition notebook could fully erase, because grief and love do not obey the tidy timelines we want them to. And for about 4 full days after that evening, I found myself constructing, almost against my own will, an entire alternate version of our future where I called Patricia and told her to pause everything, where Greg moved back in, where we went to the couples counseling he'd asked for all along, where Owen's birthdays went back to being uncomplicated. I called Dana on the third of those 4 days and I told her, half ashamed of myself, that I couldn't stop thinking about it. And she did not tell me I was wrong to feel that way, which I will always be grateful for. But she asked me one question that ended up doing more work than any lecture could have. She asked, if he came home tomorrow, genuinely, fully, and you never found out one more detail about any of this ever again, would you actually trust him alone in a hotel at a work conference next June? I sat with that question for a long time on the phone, long enough that Dana simply waited, and I finally said, honestly, no. I don't think I ever would again, not for one single trip for the rest of both our lives. And she said, gently, then I think you already have your answer, Melissa. You're just grieving the answer, which is a different thing entirely from not knowing it. She was right, and I want to be honest that grieving the answer took considerably longer than finding it. I cried that week, more than I had in the entire 6 weeks of quiet investigation combined. Not because I doubted my decision, but because grief, I learned, does not require doubt to justify itself. It only requires loss. And I had lost something enormous and real, regardless of whose fault it was. An entire imagined future, a whole shared old age I had once assumed, without ever examining the assumption that Greg and I would arrive at together. I let myself grieve that specific loss fully for the better part of a week, crying in the shower some mornings before the kids woke up, and then, deliberately, the way you close a book you've finished even if you're not entirely ready to put it down, I stopped, and I did not revisit that particular door again for the rest of the year. I want to talk, too, about how Owen and Lily moved through that year, because their resilience, and their occasional total lack of it, taught me more about honesty than almost anything else I went through myself. Owen, true to 14, processed almost everything through baseball in silence, some weeks talking to me easily about his father, other weeks going quiet for days at a time in a way that worried me until his school counselor, a kind, sharp woman named Ms. Ferris, who I met with monthly starting that October, reassured me that this kind of intermittent withdrawal was developmentally normal for a boy his age navigating something this large. That presence without pressure mattered more than getting him to talk on my schedule rather than his. Lily, younger and more openly emotional, went through a phase in the late fall of asking, almost nightly, whether I was going to leave too, a question that broke my heart every single time and that I answered the same patient way every single time. No, sweetheart, I am not going anywhere, ever, until eventually, sometime around the holidays, she stopped needing to ask, not because I gave her some magic reassuring speech, but simply because month after month of consistent, unchanged bedtimes and unchanged mornings had done the reassuring on their own, slowly, the way trust actually rebuilds in children, through repetition rather than declaration. My mother, Carol, took the news harder in some ways than I expected, not angry at Greg exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but grieving her own version of the loss. The son-in-law she genuinely loved for 16 years, the family gatherings that would now require careful, diplomatic scheduling around 2 households instead of 1. She said something to me, that first Sunday dinner after the confrontation, that I have carried with me since, sitting at her kitchen table where I'd once done the arithmetic of my own childhood without knowing it was arithmetic at all. She said, Melissa, I am so sorry this happened to you, and I am so proud of how carefully you're handling it. And I want you to know that being right about something does not mean it has to stop hurting. You're allowed to have both of those at the same time for as long as you need to. I did not fully understand in September how long I would in fact need to hold both of those things at once. I understand it much better now. I want to tell you about that first Thanksgiving, 7 months after the phone call, 4 months into the legal separation, because I think holidays reveal something about a broken family's new shape that ordinary Tuesdays don't, and because getting through that particular week taught me things about myself I don't think I could have learned any other way. My mother hosted, as she always did, and the question of whether Greg would be there landed in a strange, uncharted space none of us had navigated before, since we were technically separated but not yet divorced, cordial in front of the children but no longer married in any real sense, and my mother, ever practical, solved it the way she solved most difficult things in her life, by simply asking me directly what I wanted rather than assuming. I decided, after several days of going back and forth, that Greg should come for the early part of the day, the meal itself, for the kids' sake, and that he would leave before the evening board games and the specific extended family chaos that used to be one of my favorite parts of the holiday. A chaos that felt, that year, like it belonged to a version of our family I wasn't ready to perform inside for a full 12 hours. He arrived at noon, brought a pie from the bakery near his new apartment, sat at the far end of the table from me without either of us needing to discuss the seating arrangement out loud, and made careful, pleasant conversation with my extended family, most of whom knew, by then, at least the broad outline of what had happened, and handled it with a grace that surprised me. Nobody freezing him out, nobody making pointed comments, just a slightly more careful, slightly quieter version of the usual holiday noise, adults visibly working to keep the day normal for Owen and Lily's sake. I remember standing in my mother's kitchen around 1 in the afternoon, helping her with the gravy, and looking through the doorway at Greg sitting with Owen, the two of them arguing good-naturedly about a football game on the muted television in the background. Owen's whole face lit up the specific, uncomplicated way it always used to be before March, and I felt something complicated move through me. Not longing exactly. I was fairly certain by then that I did not want my marriage back, but a kind of grief for the specific, particular family Thanksgiving we used to have, without any of this careful new choreography, the version where Greg carved the turkey at our own table instead of a guest at my mother's, where none of the adults in the room were quietly managing an audience of relatives who now knew things about my marriage I'd never intended anyone outside our own four walls to know. Greg left around 2:30, hugging both kids for a long time at the door, and after he'd gone, my mother found me in the kitchen again, drying a serving dish that didn't need drying, and she said, without preamble, "You did that beautifully, Melissa." And I said, "It didn't feel beautiful. It felt exhausting." And she said, "Most of the beautiful things worth doing in this life are also exhausting, sweetheart. That's usually how you know they're the right ones." I thought about that sentence a great deal over the following weeks, through Christmas, which I handled with a similar, careful choreography, Greg coming Christmas morning for presents and staying until early afternoon before the kids went with him for Christmas Eve at his own apartment for the first time. A new tradition none of us had chosen, but all of us, slowly, awkwardly, began to accept as simply the shape our family now had. I cried on Christmas night after the kids were with Greg and the house was, for the first time on that particular holiday in 16 years, entirely silent. But I noticed, sitting alone in my quiet living room with a glass of wine and the tree lights still on, that the crying that night felt different than it had in May. Less like a wound freshly opened and more like the specific necessary ache of a bone that was healing correctly, but still, understandably, hurt when the weather changed. I want to mention one more detail from that same season because it stayed with me. Owen, on New Year's Eve, sitting with me on the couch after Lily had gone to bed, asked, out of nowhere, whether I thought Dad and I would ever get back together, not hopefully exactly, more like a boy doing his own quiet arithmetic and wanting the actual sum rather than a comforting estimate. And I told him the truth, gently but plainly, that I didn't think so, that some things, once they break in a certain specific way, don't go back to their original shape even with a great deal of care and time, but that both his parents loved him exactly as much as we always had, and that would never once be in question. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Okay," and rested his head on my shoulder for a few minutes the way he used to when he was much younger, and we watched the ball drop together on television at 9 o'clock, our own early version of midnight. And I remember thinking that this, a 14-year-old boy asking a hard question and accepting a hard answer with his head on his mother's shoulder, was its own small, quiet proof that we were, all three of us still living in that house, going to be entirely okay. I started individual therapy in late May, a week after the confrontation, with a counselor named Dr. Renata Ochoa, whose office sat above a bakery downtown, so that every single Thursday session that entire year began with the smell of fresh bread drifting up through the floor vents. An oddly comforting detail I still think about, the specific way grief and the smell of cinnamon rolls became permanently linked in my memory, for reasons that have nothing to do with either one. Dr. Ochoa did not, in our early sessions, try to rush me toward forgiveness or acceptance or any of the tidy emotional milestones I half expected therapy to march me through on some predetermined schedule. She spent the first 2 months mostly just letting me talk, letting me describe the phone call, the composition notebook, the bracelet over and over in slightly different words each time. And I remember asking her, around July, whether it was normal that I still needed to describe the exact same event so many times, and she said something I've held on to since, which was, "Melissa, you are not repeating yourself because you're stuck. You are repeating yourself because trauma gets processed in layers, and each time you tell it, you are integrating a slightly deeper layer of what happened to you. This is what healing actually looks like. It rarely looks like the single dramatic breakthrough people expect from movies. Work, oddly, became one of the steadiest parts of that entire year, a fact that surprised me given how little bandwidth I felt like I had some mornings for 26 9-year-olds and their long division. But Jefferson Elementary and the specific rhythm of a classroom, the bell schedule, the read-aloud time after lunch, the bulletin board I updated every month without fail for 15 years, gave me a structure that private life, in its total upheaval, could no longer offer. And I found myself, more than once that fall, grateful in a way I'd never quite articulated before for a job that required me to show up fully present for 8 hours a day, regardless of what had happened the night before. My principal, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, who is in fact Priya Patel's aunt, small world in the way small towns and small industries both tend to be, noticed sometime in October that I seemed thinner, more tired, and asked gently if everything was all right at home. And I told her, in broad strokes, enough to explain occasional distraction without turning my classroom into the subject of teachers' lounge gossip, and she simply said, "Take whatever personal days you need, Melissa. Your work has never once suffered here, and I don't expect it to start now. But that doesn't mean you have to pretend nothing's happening." I want to describe one particular Tuesday in October, 7 months after the phone call, because it became, privately, a kind of turning point for me, though nothing dramatic happened in it at all. I came home from school, made dinner for just myself and the kids, the new normal by then, and after they went to bed, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes by hand out of the same old habit from my mother's house, the same ritual that had been running in the background of my marriage every single Tuesday for 16 years. Except this time, there was no shower running upstairs. No tuneless humming drifting down through the pipes, just the sound of water and the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and I stood there and cried, not from grief exactly, something more layered than that, and then, somewhere in the middle of drying the last plate, I noticed that the silence in the house did not actually feel unbearable, the way I had expected it to feel for the rest of my life. It felt, instead, like a room that was mine, entirely mine, in a way no room in that house had ever quite been mine before. And I remember setting the last plate in the rack and feeling something shift, quietly, permanently, a small internal door closing on the version of me that needed that upstairs shower running to feel like the night was proceeding correctly. I threw myself that fall and winter into things I had quietly set aside for years without ever fully noticing I'd set them aside. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center on Wednesday evenings, something Greg had always gently teased as impractical back when we discussed it in our 20s, and I discovered at 41 that I was terrible at it and did not care even slightly, that there was something profoundly restorative about failing at something low stakes on purpose, after a year of getting everything else so exactly, meticulously right. I started running again, slow, unglamorous 3-mile loops around the reservoir near our house, mornings before school, and I lost, over the year, In a way, I want to be careful about how I describe because I don't think weight is really the point of this part of the story. Some version of the tightly wound tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders since March, replaced gradually with the specific, hard-won looseness that comes from moving your body through difficulty on purpose instead of just enduring difficulty that arrives uninvited. By the following January, 10 months after the phone call, I noticed something that surprised me enough that I mentioned it to Dr. Ochoa the following Thursday. I had gone an entire week without thinking, even once, about Vanessa Reyes, without running the old math of dates and hotel charges through my head, without picturing the apartment in the short north neighborhood. Dr. Ochoa smiled, the particular quiet smile she reserved for moments she considered genuinely significant, and said, "That's not forgetting, Melissa. That's recovery. And I want to tell you, if you are listening to this somewhere in your own version of the quiet weeks, that recovery does not arrive as a single door swinging open. It arrives the way morning arrives, so gradually that you cannot name the exact minute the sky stopped being dark. And then one day you look up and it has simply, undeniably, become light. I want to tell you about the specific way Cedar Falls itself, the town, the community, the particular small city ecosystem of people who had known both Greg and me for years, absorbed and reacted to what happened, because I think it shaped my recovery almost as much as therapy or friendship did, in ways I did not expect going into that first summer. Cedar Falls is not large, roughly 30,000 people, small enough that Greg and I had, over 16 years, accumulated the specific dense web of shared acquaintances that comes from raising kids in the same school district, attending the same church on the holidays. We bothered attending church at all, buying groceries at the same 2 stores, coaching the same Pop Warner teams, and I understood almost immediately after the confrontation that whatever else happened next, this particular chapter of my life was not going to unfold in private the way it might have in a larger, more anonymous city. It started, the way these things always seem to, with Owen's baseball team. 2 of the other mothers in the bleachers, women I'd known for years, casual friends rather than close ones, clearly picked up some version of the story that summer, likely through the same Halden Equipment Group grapevine that had eventually reached Dana through her husband's cousin. And I noticed, at the first practice after word had apparently spread, a subtle but unmistakable shift in how a few people looked at me. Not unkind exactly, more like the specific careful. Slightly too gentle attention people direct at someone they've just learned is going through something hard. The tilted head, the extra beat of eye contact, the "how are you doing?" Really, that carries more weight than the same 4 words would carry on an ordinary day. I found this harder, in some ways, than I expected to, harder even than some of the actual legal proceedings, because it meant I could no longer control the story the way I'd controlled it during the quiet weeks, when I alone knew what was happening and could decide moment by moment who learned what and when. Once it was out in the wider fabric of the town, I had to learn to exist inside a version of my own life that other people now had opinions about, sympathy for, sometimes, uncomfortably, curiosity about. And I remember one particularly difficult conversation at a school fundraiser that October with a woman named Brenda Kowalski, the mayor's wife, actually. Someone I'd always liked well enough, who cornered me near the raffle table and said, with what I believe she genuinely intended as kindness, "Melissa, honey, I just want you to know, we all think you're being so strong through all of this." And I smiled and thanked her and excused myself to check on the silent auction items and cried a little in my car afterward, not because she'd been unkind, but because being called strong by near strangers at a school fundraiser made the whole thing feel, for a moment, like public property in a way I wasn't prepared for. Dr. Ochoa helped me develop a specific practical strategy for these moments that I want to share because I think it's genuinely useful beyond my own situation. She suggested I prepare, in advance, 2 or 3 short, calm responses I could deploy without having to improvise honesty on the spot every single time someone raised the subject. Phrases like, "We're doing okay, thank you for asking," or "It's been a hard year, but we're finding our footing." sentences true enough to satisfy without requiring me to relitigate the entire composition notebook in a grocery store aisle every time an acquaintance asked a well-meaning question. This turned out to matter enormously because I discovered that most people, Brenda Kowalski included, were not actually asking for the full story. They were asking for reassurance that I was going to be all right, and giving them a genuine, brief, calm answer usually satisfied that need completely and let both of us move on with our day. Not everyone handled it with Brenda's clumsy kindness, though, and I want to be honest about the handful of people who handled it worse. There was a father on Owen's team, someone I'd always found a little too fond of his own opinions at the best of times, who made a joke at a team barbecue that August, something about Greg trading up for a younger model, said, I believe, without any real malice. Simply the kind of tone-deaf attempt at humor some men default to when a subject makes them uncomfortable. And I watched 3 other parents within earshot go stiff and silent, and I said, evenly, in a voice I'd practiced with Dr. Ochoa for exactly this kind of moment, "That's not actually funny," and walked away before he could respond. And I want to tell you that walking away in that specific, calm, unapologetic way, rather than laughing along the way, an older version of myself might have to smooth over an awkward moment, felt like its own small victory. One more piece of the self-respect I'd been rebuilding since March, finally showing up in real time, in public, in front of people who knew exactly what had happened to my marriage. By the following spring, roughly a year after the confrontation, I noticed that the extra beat of attention had largely faded from most interactions around town, that I had simply become, in most people's eyes, a divorced mother of 2, rather than the specific current subject of anyone's active curiosity. And I want to say honestly that this fading mattered to me more than I expected it to. Not because I was ashamed of anything that had happened, I had done nothing wrong in any part of this story, but because I badly wanted my ordinary life back. Grocery store trips that were simply grocery store trips. Baseball games that were simply baseball games. A version of Cedar Falls where Melissa Corwin was known, again primarily as Owen and Lily's mother, and a good 4th-grade teacher, rather than as the woman whose husband's affair had briefly become the most interesting piece of gossip the town had produced in years. I want to go back and tell you about the day the divorce was finalized in more detail than I gave it before, because at the time I described it briefly, almost clinically, the way I described a great deal of the legal process, and I think that undersells what actually happened inside me that morning in February. Patricia had told me the hearing itself would likely take less than 20 minutes, a formality by that point since every substantive issue, the house, the custody schedule, the division of retirement accounts, had already been hammered out over 4 months of mediation the previous fall. And she was right. It took 18 minutes by the clock on the courtroom wall, a judge with tired eyes and a stack of a dozen other cases waiting behind ours, reviewing the settlement, asking each of us in turn whether we understood and agreed to its terms, and pronouncing, in a voice with no more weight or ceremony than someone reading a grocery list, that the marriage of Gregory Allen Corwin and Melissa Ann Corwin was dissolved. I sat very still for a moment after the gavel. If there even was a gavel. I genuinely cannot remember now whether there was an actual gavel or whether my memory has simply added one, because that's what endings are supposed to sound like. And I felt in that 18-minute window almost nothing that matched what I expected to feel walking in. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel devastated. I felt mostly a strange kind of administrative closure, the specific unglamorous relief of finally filing the last form in a process that had taken up residence in my chest for 11 months, the way you feel finishing your taxes rather than the way you feel at the end of a movie. Greg and I walked out of the courtroom 8 feet apart, not speaking, and shook hands, actually shook hands, in the hallway outside, an oddly formal gesture between 2 people who had shared a bed for 16 years. And he said quietly, "Take care of yourself, Melissa." And I said, "Take care of the kids on Thursday. Don't forget Owen has practice at 5. And that was the entire final exchange of our marriage, logistics about a 14-year-old's baseball schedule. which felt, somehow, exactly right, because logistics about our children was the one thing that had remained steady and functional between us through the entire wreckage of everything else. I drove to Dana's house directly from the courthouse instead of going home because we'd planned it that way weeks in advance, and she had a bottle of wine open and a box of my favorite donuts from the bakery below Dr. Ochoa's office sitting on her kitchen counter, and she hugged me at the door for a long time without saying anything at all, which was exactly what I needed. And eventually she pulled back and looked at me and said, "So, how do you feel?" And I remember laughing, actually laughing for the first time that entire day, because the honest answer was so anticlimactic. I said, "Dana, I feel like I just finished grading a really long stack of essays." She laughed too, and we sat at her kitchen table eating donuts at 11 in the morning like we were teenagers skipping class. And I want to tell you that this ordinary, unglamorous afternoon, wine and donuts, and a friend who had shown up for every single week of an entire terrible year did more to make the divorce feel real and survivable than the 18 minutes in the actual courtroom ever could have. I called my mother that afternoon, and she cried a little on the phone. Not for me exactly, she was careful to say, but for the 18-year-old version of me she remembered introducing to Greg's mother for the first time at a nervous dinner decades earlier. Grieving, I think, a very long timeline of memories that now had to be reclassified in her own head as belonging to a marriage that no longer existed. She asked if I wanted her to come stay with me that first weekend, and I told her, honestly, that I thought I needed to spend it alone. The first entirely quiet weekend of my adult life with the kids at their father's for his newly regular custody weekend, and she understood. She always understood. And she simply said, "Call me if that changes, sweetheart, day or night. And I love you more than you will ever fully understand until you watch your own children go through something this hard." That weekend, alone in the house on Maple Ridge Court for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did something I had been putting off for almost a year. I went up to our old bedroom closet, the boot at the back where the composition notebook had lived for 6 weeks the previous spring, long since transferred to Patricia's office as part of the discovery record, and then eventually returned to me once the case was closed, and I took the notebook out and the bracelet in its Ziploc bag, which Patricia had advised me to keep rather than return, given its evidentiary role, and I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, looking at both objects, the physical residue of the worst 6 weeks of my life, and I made a decision. I kept the notebook. I have it still, in a drawer in my desk now rather than a boot in a closet, not out of any morbid attachment to the pain of that spring, but because it represents, to me, the exact moment I stopped being a passive object in my own story and became, instead, the person actively investigating and eventually authoring what happened next. The bracelet I donated, mailing it anonymously to a nonprofit 2 counties over that resells donated jewelry to fund services for women rebuilding their lives after domestic upheaval, because I did not want it in my house for one more day, and because there was something quietly satisfying about turning the one physical object most associated with my husband's betrayal into something that might, indirectly, help some other woman I would never meet get her own footing back. I want to tell you about the one time I actually saw Vanessa Reyes in person, because it happened, unexpectedly, in a way neither of us could have planned for, and because I think how I handled it says something about how far I had actually come by that point, further than I would have guessed possible back in the composition notebook days. It was late April, 14 months after the phone call, 2 months after the divorce was finalized, and Owen had a travel baseball tournament in Columbus, a genuine honor for a 14-year-old, several college scouts reportedly in attendance for the older kids on his squad, and Greg, exercising his entirely reasonable right as a father who loved his son's baseball career as much as I did, was there too, sitting in the bleachers a respectful distance from me, the way we had both gotten quietly, carefully good at doing over the past year at school events and family gatherings. Between games, walking to get water at a concession stand near the far field, I saw her. I knew her instantly, of course, from 14 months of studying Instagram photographs I had once printed at a public library with shaking hands. though she looked different in person somehow, smaller, more ordinary, a woman in workout leggings and a Halden Equipment Group quarter zip standing near the fence with two other women I didn't recognize, presumably there, supporting a nephew or a coworker's kid on one of the other teams. The specific coincidental collision that happens constantly in a metro area the size of Columbus without either party planning for it. She saw me at almost the exact same moment I saw her, and I watched her face go through a fast, visible cascade of recognition and alarm, and for one long second, neither of us moved. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that second, because I had spent a great deal of therapy time with Dr. Ochoa imagining exactly this scenario, wargaming it, she called it gently, preparing me for a moment I always assumed would eventually happen given how small the professional and social circles around Columbus really were. I felt first a hot, immediate spike of something close to the old rage. 14 months compressed instantly back down to zero. The bracelet, the hotel elevator photograph, all of it flooding back in under a second. And then, just as quickly, I felt something else arrive right behind it, quieter. And I want to describe it precisely because I think it was the actual measure of how much that year had changed me. I felt nothing I needed to do about the rage. I did not need to say anything to her. I did not need her to apologize or explain or even acknowledge me beyond that single frozen second of mutual recognition. I nodded once, small, entirely neutral, the nod you give a stranger you vaguely recognize from somewhere and cannot quite place. And I turned and continued walking toward the concession stand, and I bought a water and a bag of sunflower seeds for Owen, and I walked back to the bleachers, and I sat back down next to Dana, who had come to the tournament with me, and she looked at my face and said quietly, "You okay?" And I said, "Actually, yes," and I meant it, completely, in a way that surprised me more than it should have. I did not tell Greg I'd seen her. It was not by that point information he needed from me, and giving it to him would have served no purpose except possibly to make him feel something, guilt or awkwardness or some complicated third thing that was no longer mine to manage on his behalf. I drove home from that tournament, Owen's team having won both games that day, Owen himself glowing with the specific unself-conscious joy of a 14-year-old who had gone 3 for 4 at the plate and did not yet fully understand or need to understand the complicated adult undercurrents of the day around him. And I remember thinking, somewhere on the drive back down Route 33, that this, exactly this, an ordinary drive home with sunflower seed shells in the cup holder and my son quietly reliving his own double in the back seat, was the actual finish line I'd been working toward since that Tuesday in March, 14 months earlier. Not a courtroom, not a confrontation. Just an ordinary good day undisturbed by a chance encounter that would have derailed me completely a year before. Owen finished that school year, his freshman year, with a batting average his coach called legitimately special for his age group, and made the varsity roster as an incoming sophomore that fall, a milestone Greg and I both attended together, sitting 8 feet apart in the bleachers the way we'd learned to, both of us cheering the same loud, undignified cheer at the same moment when Owen's name was announced, a small involuntary synchrony that still existed between us even after everything. Because some things, the specific shared joy of watching a child you both made succeed at something he loves, apparently survive a divorce fully intact even when almost nothing else does. Lily, meanwhile, moved up a level in her ballet program that same year, earning a solo in the spring recital for the first time. 4 minutes of a piece I watched from the third row with tears running freely down my face. Not sad tears, not anymore. Just the specific overflow of watching a 10-year-old who had spent a year quietly asking whether I was going to leave too, standing entirely alone under a single spotlight, utterly certain of every single step, having apparently, somewhere in that year, rebuilt for herself the exact kind of confidence I had spent months rebuilding in myself. I want to tell you about the trip I took with Owen and Lily that first summer after the divorce was finalized, because it became, unexpectedly, one of the most important weeks of the entire year, the The moment I understood, concretely rather than just theoretically, that our smaller family was not a diminished version of what we'd had before, but simply a different, equally real one. I had never once, in 16 years of marriage, planned and executed an entire vacation alone. Greg had always handled the logistics, the rental car, the hotel bookings, a competent take-charge quality of his I genuinely missed for the first time that spring when I sat down to plan something for just the three of us. And I want to admit honestly that I felt a real flicker of panic looking at flight comparison websites alone at my kitchen table, wondering whether I was capable of doing this well without him. I decided on a week at a lake house in northern Michigan, modest, nothing extravagant, a place my own family had rented once when I was a child that I remembered with a specific, golden nostalgia I wanted to hand down to my own kids. And I booked it myself, packed the car myself, drove the entire 6 hours myself while Owen navigated from the passenger seat with a competence that surprised me, and Lily narrated the passing scenery from the back seat with the specific, relentless commentary only a 10-year-old can sustain for 6 consecutive hours. We arrived at a small wooden cabin with a dock and a canoe and a screen porch that smelled like cedar. And I remember standing on that dock the first evening, watching my 2 children jump off the end of it into water, cold enough to make them shriek, exactly the way I'd once imagined them running through a sprinkler in our own backyard on some warm afternoon that never came the way I'd pictured it. And understanding that joy, real joy, had simply found a different shape to arrive in rather than disappearing altogether. We fell into a rhythm that week that felt entirely our own, mornings on the dock, afternoons in the canoe, which I capsized twice trying to teach Lily to paddle, and which became, by the third capsizing, the funniest recurring joke of the entire vacation. Evenings playing cards on the screen porch by lantern light. Because the cabin's only television got 2 fuzzy channels neither kid cared enough to fight over. Owen taught himself to fish off that dock over the course of the week, patient in a way that surprised me given how little patience he generally showed for anything that wasn't baseball. And caught, on the 5th evening, a modest base, he insisted on having me photograph from 11 different angles before we finally released it. And Lily spent hours collecting smooth stones from the shallows, sorting them by color into a shoebox she brought home and kept on her windowsill for months afterward. I called Dana one evening from the end of that dock, cell service spotty enough that our conversation kept cutting out, and told her when I finally got a clear stretch of signal that I'd just had one of the best days of the entire year, better than any single day of my marriage's final months, better in some ways than days I remembered from years before that when things were supposedly fine. And she said quietly, "That's not an accident, Melissa. That's what it looks like when you stop performing a life for an audience and just start living the one that's actually yours." I thought about that sentence for the rest of the trip, turning it over the way I'd once turned over dates and hotel charges in a composition notebook, and I decided she was right, that some part of my last several years of marriage, even before I had any idea Greg was being unfaithful, had involved a subtle, constant awareness of him. Whether he was pleased, whether the house looked the way he liked it, whether I was being the wife I assumed he needed, and that this entire lake house week, plain and modest and gloriously unglamorous, had been the first extended stretch of time in longer than I could remember where I was, simply, fully, without any performance at all, myself. On the last night, sitting on the dock after both kids had gone to bed, the lake completely black and silent except for the occasional call of a loon somewhere across the water, I let myself think, honestly, about the entire arc of the previous 15 months, the phone call, the composition notebook, the confrontation, the mediation table in November, the courthouse in February, and I felt something settle in my chest that I want to describe as carefully as I can, because I think it's the actual emotional center of this whole story. It was not happiness exactly, not yet, that would come later, gradually, the way January's realization about Vanessa arrived gradually. It was something more like solid ground, the specific physical sensation of standing somewhere that was not going to shift or crack or reveal some hidden second layer underneath it, because I had built it myself, plank by plank, the same patient way I'd once built a case against a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered long before I understood it had. I drove home from that lake 3 days later with 2 sunburned, exhausted, deeply happy children asleep in the back seat, and I remember thinking that whatever else that year had cost me, it had also, unmistakably, given me this: a family that was smaller than it used to be, and somehow, in ways I would not have believed possible 15 months earlier, more solidly, honestly mine than it had ever been before. I want to tell you about Marcus Ibanez now, carefully, because I do not want this part of the story to sound like the tidy romantic bow some people expect at the end of a story like this. And it is not that, not yet, maybe not ever, but it is real, and it belongs here. I met him the following June, 15 months after the phone call, at a parent information night for Lily's upcoming 5th grade year. The kind of forgettable Tuesday evening event where 30 exhausted parents sit in undersized elementary school chairs, listening to a vice principal explain the new lunch schedule. And I ended up sitting next to a man I did not recognize. Tall, quiet, with the specific tired kindness in his face of someone who has been doing a hard job alone for a while, who introduced himself as Owen's friend, Diego's father, recently moved to Cedar Falls from Toledo after his own divorce 2 years earlier, and who spent the entire hour-long meeting making dry, quiet observations about the vice principal's PowerPoint slides that made me laugh twice in a room where laughing felt almost illicit. We did not exchange numbers that night. I want to be honest that even after everything, even 15 months out, some careful, scarred part of me was not ready to move quickly toward anything, and Marcus, I would learn, understood that instinct completely because he was carrying a version of it himself. His own marriage having ended not through betrayal, but through a slow, mutual, exhausted drift that he described to me, much later as somehow harder to explain to people than infidelity would have been, because there was no clean villain in his story, just 2 people who had quietly stopped being right for each other over a decade. We ran into each other 3 more times that summer, at the same school pickup line, at a 4th of July community event at the park, at Lily's dance recital because his daughter, it turned out, took class 2 rooms down from her, and each time we talked a little longer, a little easier, until finally, in August, 16 months after that Tuesday phone call, he asked if I would want to get coffee sometime. Just coffee. No particular pressure attached to the word, and I said yes. I want to describe what that first coffee felt like, because it was nothing like meeting Greg at that backyard barbecue 18 years earlier. Nothing like the giddy, uncomplicated ease of 23-year-olds with their whole unmarked future in front of them. It felt careful. It felt like 2 adults who had both been seriously hurt in very different ways, quietly, respectfully testing whether there was room in either of their rebuilt lives for something new, without either of us pretending the past simply hadn't happened. Marcus asked me, that first coffee, plainly, "What happened with your marriage, if you don't mind me asking?" And I told him, in broad strokes, enough of the truth without turning our first conversation into the entire composition notebook. And he listened the way I have come to understand some people simply know how to listen, without immediately trying to fix or minimize or compare it to his own story. And at the end he said, simply, "That sounds like it took an enormous amount of strength to get through, the quiet parts especially." And I remember thinking, driving home, that it was the first time in over a year that a man had described what I'd done. Not as sad or unfortunate or even brave in the performative sense people sometimes mean, but specifically, accurately, as strong, which is a smaller word than it sounds like, but landed, that afternoon, like something much bigger. We have been seeing each other since, slowly, carefully, on a timeline that suits 2 people who are done rushing anything in their lives. And I want to be honest that I do not know, as I'm telling you this, exactly where it leads, whether Marcus Ibanez becomes a permanent chapter of my life, or simply an important, gentle bridge between the woman the divorce left me, as and whoever I eventually become, fully on the other side of all of it. What I do know, and what feels important enough to say plainly, is that I did not go looking for him to complete some story arc, to prove to Greg or to Vanessa or to anyone watching that I'd landed on my feet. I met him because I kept showing up to ordinary Tuesday evenings at my daughter's school, doing the unglamorous work of simply continuing to live a full, present life. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary continuing, something good happened to find me, which I have come to believe is usually the only way anything good actually finds anyone. Owen is 15 now, heading into his sophomore year with a starting spot on varsity that still makes him grin every time someone mentions it. Lily is 11, a full grade further into her ballet training, taller than I fully precessed until I measured her against the pencil marks in the hall closet doorframe last month and found she'd grown 4 inches since the year all of this started. Both of them see their father every other weekend and one weeknight, a rhythm that has become simply the ordinary texture of their lives now rather than the raw wound it once was. And Greg, to his credit, and I want to give credit where it belongs even in a story about what he did wrong, has been steady and present in that role in a way that matters enormously to both kids. Showing up on time, never missing a game he's scheduled to attend, slowly rebuilding brick by brick. The specific kind of trust that takes years to repair and about 30 seconds to shatter. I do not know if I will ever fully trust him again in the broader sense. The sense that once let me hand him my whole unguarded life without a second thought, and I have made peace with the fact that I probably won't, and that this is not a tragedy, it is simply the accurate adjusted shape of a relationship that now exists for one single, unchangeable reason, which is that we made 2 remarkable children together, and both of us love them more than either of us has ever loved anything else in this world. I want to add one more thing about Marcus before I bring this story to its close, because Dr. Ochoa asked me a question last month that I think is worth sharing here. She asked whether I had noticed any specific way the last 2 years had changed what I actually look for in another person. And I sat with that question for a while before I answered her, because I wanted to be precise, rather than simply reaching for the easy, expected answer about trust or honesty that anyone would offer after living through what I lived through. What I told her, and what I believe is true, is that I no longer mistake competence for character the way I think I quietly did in my 20s, back when Greg's easy confidence, his ability to carry a room at a party, his steady climb up the ranks at Halden, all registered to me as evidence of a fundamentally solid, trustworthy man, when in fact none of those qualities actually measure trustworthiness at all. They simply measure capability, and capable people are perfectly able to build entire second lives with the same skill they bring to everything else. What I look for now, in Marcus, in anyone, is something quieter and slower to observe, whether a person's private behavior matches their public behavior when they think no one of consequence is watching, whether they speak about their ex-spouse, their coworkers, their own past mistakes with accountability or with careful self-serving narrative, whether small promises, the kind that cost nothing to break and nothing to keep, get kept anyway, simply because keeping them is who that person actually is underneath. Marcus has passed every one of those quieter tests so far, not because he's performed for me. I don't think he even knows most of them are tests, but because of 100 small, unremarkable moments that added up slowly over the past year. The way he talks about his ex-wife with genuine, unbitter respect despite a divorce that clearly still costs him something. The way he shows up exactly when he says he will without needing reminders. The way he asked, early on, real detailed questions about Owen and Lily's schedules and needs before he ever asked anything about our own relationship moving forward, understanding correctly that I came as a package with 2 children whose stability mattered more to me than any romance ever could. I do not know exactly where this goes, and I want to end on that honest uncertainty rather than a tidier ending than I actually have, because I think tidy endings are one more kind of dishonesty, and I have had enough of dishonesty to last several lifetimes. What I know is that I am, today, A woman who built an 11-page notebook out of a misdialed phone call, who sat across a coffee shop table from a private investigator without flinching, who stood in a courtroom for 18 minutes and walked out steadier than she walked in, who has rebuilt a smaller, more honest, more entirely her own life out of the wreckage of a much larger one. And whatever comes next, whether it's Marcus Ibanez or someone else entirely, or simply the continued ordinary joy of raising Owen and Lily on my own terms, I trust that woman completely to handle it, because I have watched her handle everything else this past year and a half with a steadiness I did not know, before any of this started, that I actually possessed. People ask me, when I tell this story now, whether I regret the 6 weeks of silence, whether I wish I had simply confronted Greg the moment I hung up that misdialed phone call, screamed, demanded answers on the spot. And I understand why they ask, because our culture tends to admire the immediate, explosive reaction more than the patient, documented one, as though rage proves the seriousness of the betrayal better than a composition notebook does. But I want to tell you, as clearly as I can, why I would make the exact same choice again, every single time without hesitation. If I had confronted Greg that first night, on nothing but a stranger's 4 seconds of misdirected excitement about a hotel view, I believe, with real confidence built from watching how skillfully he shaped his own story, even after I laid 22 photographs on our coffee table, that he would have found some way to minimize it, to reframe it, to buy himself time to manage what I knew and how I knew it. The 6 weeks of quiet were not cowardice. They were the only leverage I had in a situation where he held every other advantage: more information than me, more practice at deception than me, and 8 months of head start. I think the deepest lesson of this entire year, the one I would want any woman listening to this to actually carry with her rather than simply nod along to, is that clarity is not cruelty. Watching quietly, gathering the truth before you act on it, is not the same thing as being cold or calculating or somehow less wounded than the woman who screams in the driveway the night she finds a receipt. It is, I have come to believe, one of the only forms of genuine self-respect available to a person who has been deliberately deceived, because deception thrives on your uncertainty, on your willingness to accept the first reasonable explanation and move on. And the only real defense against that is patient, unglamorous documentation, the kind that does not care how it makes you look in the retelling, only whether it holds up. I also want to say something about the specific mathematics of betrayal, because I did that math obsessively during the quiet weeks, and I think it matters. 8 months. That is how long the affair had been running by the time I confronted Greg in May. 8 months layered invisibly across roughly 2/3 of a full year, across a family vacation, across Owen's fall baseball season, across Lily's October recital, across an entire Thanksgiving and Christmas where I stood in my own kitchen basting a turkey while a second version of my marriage ran quietly in parallel underneath the one I thought I was living. I do the math still, sometimes, almost involuntarily. June to March, 9 months of secret. March to May, 6 weeks of investigation. May to February, 9 months of legal unwinding, the entire arc from a misdialed phone call to a judge's signature landing at just under 12 months exactly. 1 full calendar year that took something built across 16 and completely rearranged its foundations. I share these numbers not because I think anyone listening needs my particular arithmetic, but because I think there is something clarifying about knowing exactly how long a lie can live undetected inside an otherwise ordinary, happy-looking house if the person living it is skilled enough and the person beside them trusts enough. It is longer than you think. It was longer than I ever would have guessed. 16 years into a marriage, I would have sworn, right up until 8:47 on a Tuesday night in March, I understood completely. I want to say one more thing about Vanessa Reyes's misdialed phone call itself, the specific mechanical accident that started all of this, because I have thought about it more than almost anything else in the entire story. A single wrong digit, a contact list where her thumb landed one name too high or too low, on a phone she was almost certainly holding while walking somewhere. Distracted, excited, thinking about a lake view in a hotel room, never imagining for 1 second that the number she'd actually reached belonged to the wife of the man she was discussing. I have wondered, some nights, whether the affair would simply have continued indefinitely if that one digit had landed correctly. Whether Greg would still be living in our house right now, humming his tuneless 3 notes in the shower every Tuesday, if a woman 300 miles away had pressed slightly harder or slightly softer on her own phone screen. And I have decided, after a great deal of thought, that the answer does not actually matter. Because the truth of my marriage was already exactly what it was in March, regardless of whether I discovered it that month or the next or 2 years later. The phone call did not create the betrayal. It only ended, mercifully, my own unknowing participation in it. If you are listening to this, and some part of you recognizes even a fragment of what I'm describing, a travel schedule that's crept up without a clear reason, a phone that's suddenly gone somewhere it never used to go, a feeling in your chest you can't quite name but also can't quite dismiss, I want to tell you the only thing I actually know for certain after everything I've been through. You are allowed to take your time. You are allowed to gather information quietly before you say a single word out loud. You are allowed to grieve an answer you already know before you're ready to act on it. And you are allowed, whatever you eventually decide, to trust that the version of yourself capable of sitting at a kitchen table for 6 weeks, building an honest record of your own life, rather than exploding at the first 4 seconds of suspicion, is not a cold version of yourself. She is, I have come to believe, the strongest version. The one who deserves, more than any other version of you, to be the one who decides what happens next. I want to go back and tell you about Kevin, the coworker Greg mentioned, that Sunday afternoon in January when I caught him staring at his phone with an expression I'd never seen before, because I learned things about Kevin's role in all of this that changed how I understood one particular piece of the puzzle. And I think it belongs here, even though I did not have this information until well into the quiet weeks themselves. Kevin Marsh worked in the same regional sales office in Columbus, a colleague of Greg's for almost a decade, someone I had met exactly twice at company holiday parties and always found perfectly pleasant in the shallow way you find someone pleasant when you've spent a combined total of 40 minutes in their company across 10 years. I had assumed, when Greg mentioned him occasionally, that Kevin was simply a work friend, the kind every office has, someone to complain about quotas with over a beer after a long trip. What I learned, through Frank Delgado's careful, methodical work in the 3rd week of the investigation, was that Kevin Marsh had, in fact, covered for Greg on at least 2 occasions that Frank could document with certainty, telling me directly, when either I or possibly Greg's own office manager had asked about Greg's whereabouts during a specific late evening, that Greg was still in a meeting with him when Frank's surveillance photographs showed Greg's car parked outside the Short North apartment building at that exact hour. I do not know, and Frank could not determine with certainty whether Kevin lied knowingly, fully aware of the affair, and willing to protect a decade-long work friendship at the direct expense of a wife he'd met twice at holiday parties, or whether he simply repeated whatever cover story Greg had fed him without ever asking too many questions. The specific kind of willful non-curiosity that lets people avoid feeling complicit in something they'd rather not examine closely. I have decided in the time since that the distinction between those 2 possibilities matters less than I once thought it would, because the practical effect on my life was identical either way. One more layer of the wall built around a truth I had every right to know. I never confronted Kevin directly. Patricia advised against it, both because he was not a party to any legal proceeding and because, she pointed out gently, there was nothing to be gained by escalating a private matter into a wider professional circle, any further than the affair itself had already, inevitably, spread it once it became common knowledge at Halden's Columbus office that summer. But I want to mention him because I think he represents something worth naming honestly, the network of small, quiet accommodations that infidelity actually requires to survive undetected for 8 months. Not just the two people directly involved, but a scaffolding of friends and colleagues who look the other way, who provide cover stories without asking hard questions, who let a decade of professional camaraderie outweigh a passing loyalty to a wife they barely know. I do not think Kevin Marsh is a villain in this story in the way Greg or, to a lesser extent, Vanessa are. But I also no longer believe, the way I might have believed a year and a half ago, that silence and passive cover are entirely neutral acts. Somebody, somewhere, almost always knows more than the deceived spouse realizes, and I think it is worth saying plainly for anyone listening who might someday find themselves in Kevin's position, being asked to vouch for a friend's whereabouts without asking too many follow-up questions, that the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved, including the friend you're protecting, is usually to simply refuse to be the alibi. I want to tell you, too, about the single closest call of the entire 6 weeks of quiet investigation, a Thursday night in the 4th week when I very nearly gave everything away. I had been up late at the kitchen table with Frank Delgado's most recent report spread out in front of me, cross-referencing dates against our shared calendar, when I heard Greg's car pull into the driveway 40 minutes earlier than his usual Thursday return time, a detail that, in any other week of our marriage, would have meant nothing at all, and in that particular week sent me into a genuine, silent panic, scrambling to gather Frank's photographs and my composition notebook off the table and stuff them into a kitchen drawer we rarely used, the one with expired coupons and spare batteries, seconds before he came through the back door. He asked, perfectly innocently, what I was doing up so late, and I told him, in a voice I am still faintly amazed came out as steady as it did, that I was grading essays, gesturing vaguely at an actual stack of my students' writing that happened to be sitting nearby, which was true, just not the whole truth of what my evening had actually contained. He kissed the top of my head, entirely unaware, and went upstairs to shower, and I sat at that kitchen table for another full minute after I heard the water start running, my hands actually shaking, adrenaline moving through me the way it might for someone who'd nearly been caught doing something wrong, an irony I noted even in the moment that I felt, for those 60 seconds, like the one hiding something, when the only thing I was actually hiding was the truth about what he had already done. I moved the drawer's contents to the trunk of my car the very next morning and never again kept a single piece of evidence inside that house, a lesson I only needed to learn once. I think often about the version of myself who stood in that kitchen on that Tuesday night in March, dishwater drying on her hands, holding a phone that wasn't hers, hearing her own name spoken back to her by a stranger's voice. I do not think that woman knew, in the moment the call ended and the screen went dark, that she was capable of what came next. The 11 pages of a composition notebook, the coffee shop meetings with a private investigator, the careful, unglamorous discipline of washing dishes at 8:47 every single Tuesday for 6 weeks while a man she loved showered upstairs, entirely unaware that his wife had begun, quietly, methodically, to build a case against the life he was still, every single day, actively lying to her about. I think that woman would be surprised, and I hope in some way proud, of who she became over the following year, not because of the divorce itself. Divorce is not a triumph. It is a loss even when it is also the right decision, but because of the specific, deliberate way she chose to walk through it, refusing panic, refusing the easy satisfaction of an immediate confrontation, choosing instead the much harder, much slower path of simply insisting on the truth before insisting on anything else. It has been a little over 16 months now since that phone rang on our kitchen counter, and I want to tell you, honestly, what my life looks like today, because I think endings matter, and I do not want to leave you with the courtroom or the composition notebook or even Marcus Ibanez, careful and new as that still is, as the final image of this story. My final image is this. Last Tuesday evening, an ordinary Tuesday, nothing special about the date at all, I made dinner for Owen and Lily. Spaghetti. The same meal I was serving the night Greg first mentioned a new account coordinator named Vanessa, a little over 2 years ago now, and after dinner, after homework was checked and lunches were packed, I stood at my kitchen sink and washed the dishes by hand, the same ritual from my mother's house, the same habit that outlived an entire marriage, and the house was quiet. No shower running upstairs, no tuneless humming through the pipes, just my own 2 children upstairs doing their own quiet evening things. Owen texting a teammate about tomorrow's practice, Lily reading in bed with her lamp on 10 minutes past when she was supposed to turn it off, and I stood there with warm water running over my hands, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I can accurately measure, simply and completely at peace in my own kitchen, in my own house, in my own life, exactly as it currently, honestly exists. I was promoted this past spring to lead teacher for the 4th grade team at Jefferson Elementary, a role I'd quietly wanted for years, but had never quite found the confidence to formally pursue while I was busy holding together a marriage that, it turns out, only one of us was actually still building. Dr. Patel told me, handing me the offer letter, that she'd watched me handle an entire year of upheaval with more grace and consistency than she'd seen from teachers going through far less, and that she thought it was long past time I led with the same steadiness I brought to my own classroom every single day, regardless of what else was happening in my life. I cried a little in her office, the good kind of crying, and called Dana from the parking lot before I'd even started my car, and she screamed loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, which felt, honestly, like exactly the right response after everything the 2 of us had walked through together since that Saturday morning at her kitchen table 18 months earlier. Owen starts his sophomore year in a few weeks, a starting varsity spot waiting for him. Taller than me now by a full 2 inches, a fact he brings up with insufferable regularity. Lily begins 5th grade with a solo already promised for the fall recital, her ballet teacher having told me at the end of last year that she'd rarely seen a student progress with the specific focused determination Lily brought to the studio all year, a determination I like to believe, though I cannot prove it. She built in the exact same months she was learning that her family could break in half and she would still, somehow, land on her feet. Both kids see their father regularly, and both of them, in their own ways, at their own pace, have arrived at a version of peace with what happened that I did not think, honestly, was possible to reach this quickly, though Dr. Ochoa reminds me often that children's timelines for processing loss rarely match adults, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, and the job is simply to keep showing up consistently on whatever timeline actually turns out to be theirs. If there is one thing I would want you to take from this story, beyond my own particular details, beyond Greg and Vanessa and Kevin Marsh and Frank Delgado's careful photographs, beyond the composition notebook still sitting in my desk drawer, it is this. The truth, in my experience, almost always finds its way out eventually, whether through a misdialed phone number or a careless Instagram post or some other small, unplanned crack in a carefully built wall. Because deception this large, sustained, over months, requires a level of perfect discipline that almost no one actually maintains forever. And when that truth does find its way out, however it arrives, however ordinary or accidental the moment turns out to be, you are allowed to meet it on your own terms, at your own pace, with whatever combination of patience and steel you need to gather in order to walk through it with your dignity fully intact. I did not scream in my kitchen that Tuesday night in March. I dried my hands, and I finished the dishes, and I started quietly, the very same evening, to take my life back one honest page at a time. If you are standing somewhere near the beginning of your own version of this story right now, I want you to know that it is possible to get all the way through to the other side of it, not unscarred, not unchanged, but whole and steady, and finally, completely your own. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own life or someone you love, subscribe for a new true story like this one every single day, because there is always another one worth telling, and someone out there right now needs to hear that they are not alone in whatever quiet weeks they might be living through of their own.